Hey there, dreamers. Welcome back to our channel. Before we drift into the classic journey of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, followed by her daughter, Vanessa Doofenshmirtz, from the show Phineas and Ferb, I'd love to know what is your favorite character among the two Doofenshmirtz, and from the show overall in the comments below. It's always fascinating to know what our sleepy little community likes. All right, without further ado, lights low, blankets up, let's begin. The evening sky above the tri-state area faded into a deep, velvety blue, the last hints of sunset slowly dissolving into the horizon. High above the quieting city, a crooked tower leaned awkwardly but proudly against the skyline. Its lights glimmered faintly, as though uncertain whether to stay awake or give in to the night. This was, of course, the home and laboratory of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, a place of peculiar angles, questionable structural safety, and at this hour, an unusual hush. Inside, the Lair felt softer than it usually did. The familiar buzz of machines was gone, replaced with the gentle hum of an old desk lamp. Its circle of warm light rested over cluttered blueprints, loose screws, and abandoned tools. On one of the work tables sat a peculiar half-finished contraption with the words, "The I Really Need Sleep-inator," scribbled in bold marker across the side. Wires hung loosely, a lever stuck awkwardly in mid-turn, as if the invention itself had grown tired and given up for the evening. Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz sat slouched in his swiveling chair, his tall frame curved into an unusual posture of relaxation. His lab coat, usually pristine in its cartoonishly exaggerated way, had become a little wrinkled and bunched, while his boots were set aside, replaced by a pair of floppy slippers. It wasn't often that Heinz allowed himself this kind of comfort. Normally he was bouncing from one half-baked scheme to the next, filled with endless energy for his over-the-top monologues. Tonight, though, his energy had drained into something gentler. He looked less like a so-called evil scientist, and more like a man at the end of a very long day. Heinz let out a quiet sigh and tilted his chair back until his gaze rested on the ceiling. A single glow-in-the-dark star sticker, left over from some forgotten project, clung to the plaster like a small, defiant reminder of childhood. He squinted at it, then smiled faintly. "Ah," he said aloud, his voice surprisingly soft. "Finally, some peace and quiet, no explosions, no Perry the Platypus barging in. Though, to be fair, he might still barge in. He usually does. But until then, it is peaceful." The sound of his own words floated gently in the air, then dissolved into the silence. There was no sarcastic retort, no interruption. Just the soft hum of electricity through the walls and the faint chirping of crickets outside the cracked open window. Heinz shifted in his chair, drawing the warmth of the desk lamp closer like it was a miniature sun. The shadows stretched long across the Lair, not harsh but comfortable, like a cozy blanket laid across the room. Even the refrigerator, tucked into one corner of the lab, contributed to the nighttime symphony with its steady low hum. For a man so used to chaos, the calm was nearly overwhelming. He sipped from a chipped mug that rested on the desk. Steam drifted up in lazy spirals from the chamomile tea inside, carrying with it the faint scent of honey. The mug itself was decorated with a cartoon platypus, an odd clearance purchase Heinz had made years ago, but had since grown oddly fond of. He smiled faintly at the irony of drinking tea out of a Perry-themed cup. "Not bad," he muttered, swirling the mug softly. "A little too much honey, maybe, but, hey, I deserve honey. It's been a long day of semi-evil, which is still tiring. Mischief is exhausting, you know. Nobody talks about that." The tea warmed his hands as he carried it over to the wide glass window overlooking the tri-state area. From this height, the city looked smaller, almost fragile. Cars moved like glowing beetles across the darkened streets. Street lamps cast little halos of amber light that blurred slightly in the distance. A lone dog barked, its sound drifting up faintly. Everything below moved at its own unbothered rhythm, and for once, Heinz felt no urge to interrupt it with an invention. He leaned his elbows on the sill and watched quietly, his lanky silhouette framed by the night. The breeze that slipped in through the window was cool and smelled faintly of rain. He let it wash over him, blinking slowly as though even his eyes were growing tired. "Not bad," he whispered to himself again. "Not bad at all." And so in the quiet of the lair, with slippers on his feet, a llama print blanket draped loosely over his shoulders, and tea warming his hands, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz allowed himself the rarest invention of all, stillness. The mug grew lighter in his hands as he took slow, thoughtful sips. Each swallow of the chamomile tea seemed to press gently against the edges of his restless energy, softening the corners, easing the sharpness of his usual chatter. By the time the cup was nearly empty, Heinz found himself humming, softly, tunelessly, something that might have once been a lullaby, though it was now muddled by years and a thick accent. He placed the mug back on the sill, letting the last curls of steam drift away into the night air. The city lights blinked steadily below, patient and calm. It almost looked like the tri-state area was sleeping too. Heinz tilted his head and chuckled quietly at the thought. If only the whole city could just take a nap. Everyone lying down at the same time. Imagine that. No noise, no yelling, no traffic jams. Just quiet. For once, Heinz Doofenshmirtz would not need an inventor for peace, because peace would already be here. He sat with that thought longer than he expected. Normally, he would have spun the idea into an invention, perhaps a city-wide synchronized nap-inator, but instead he let it rest as an amusing daydream. The stillness of the moment didn't invite scheming. It only invited breathing. Behind him, the lair had shifted into something that felt almost domestic. The clutter on the tables no longer looked like the remains of chaotic experiments, but rather like the familiar scatter of someone's lived-in space. The crooked shelves held not only gadgets and blueprints, but also a few framed photos slightly tilted. One of Vanessa as a small child, one of him at some kind of obscure evil science award show, and curiously, a stock photo of a kitten he'd never gotten around to replacing. The photos were usually background noise to his frantic life, but tonight, in the golden lamplight, they looked warm, personal, angry. Heinz turned away from the window and shuffled back to his desk chair, pulling the llama blanket up properly around his shoulders. It smelled faintly of laundry detergent, the simple kind that reminded him of being younger, back before evil science had seemed like the only path. He rubbed the edge of the blanket between his fingers and sighed, sinking into the cushion with a satisfied creak. The tick-tock of a small wall clock filled the silence. Its rhythm was steady and patient, a reminder that time could move slowly if one let it. Heinz tilted his head toward the sound, matching his breathing to its rhythm. Inhale with one tick, exhale with the next. The exercise, unintentional at first, became something soothing. His shoulders sank further. His eyelids fluttered, heavy but not yet closing. He considered in the quiet the strange luxury of doing nothing. Usually he filled silence with long-winded stories of his tragic backstory or arguments with his own inventions. But now, with no one to impress and nothing to conquer, he let silence simply be silence. It was, surprisingly, enough. He thought briefly of Perry the platypus, his nemesis, his audience, his unspoken friend. The absence of the platypus tonight felt strange at first, but then, as Heinz adjusted the blanket again, he found the emptiness oddly restful. Maybe, he muttered drowsily, maybe Perry is also at home, in a blanket, sipping tea. Maybe he also hums lullabies to himself. Maybe he has a mug with my face on it. That would be nice. The thought drew a chuckle from his throat, a soft, contented sound. He let the idea linger as he leaned back further into the chair, his head tilted against the cushion, his eyes half closed, the glow from the lamp painting his features in amber tones. The Lair felt less like the headquarters of an eccentric scientist and more like an odd but cozy living room. The whir of the fridge joined the clock's ticking. The night air drifted lazily through the curtains, and somewhere outside a nightbird called once before settling. It was not silence, but it was peace, the kind that fills the air like a slow exhale. "Tomorrow," he whispered softly. "The inventions can wait. Tonight is just for resting." And with that small declaration, the room seemed to settle further, as though the walls themselves approved of the decision. The hands of the clock crept forward, each second clicking into place like a gentle tap on the shoulder. Doofenshmirtz noticed it only vaguely, as if the sound had become part of his breathing. He sat cocooned in his chair, llama blanket pulled snugly around him, slippers tapping softly as he rocked his feet. There was something childlike about the rhythm, as though he had rediscovered the comfort of rocking gently before sleep. His gaze drifted to the cluttered workbench. Half-finished gadgets sat abandoned, each labeled in his hurried handwriting. There was the left shoe only innator, the remote control that controls other remotes innator, and of course the sleep-inator, which looked more like a pile of wires with ambition than a functional invention. Normally, seeing his projects unfinished would have filled him with dramatic frustration, the kind that usually led to rants about his childhood. But tonight they looked harmless, innocent even, and like toys forgotten at bedtime. He chuckled softly to himself. "Ah, Sleep-inator, you are not ready, but then again, neither am I." His voice dropped to a whisper, almost swallowed by the still air. "Maybe tonight. I just let sleep find me instead." His chair squeaked as he turned slightly, letting his gaze wander across the shelves again. A small, crooked plant leaned toward the lamplight, its leaves drooping from neglect. Heinz squinted at it, frowning gently. "I should water you tomorrow," he muttered. Yes, a new project. Keep the plant alive. Much simpler than taking over the tri-state area. Less paperwork, too." The thought amused him, and he gave a tired laugh, shaking his head. The air grew heavier as the night deepened. Outside the window, fewer cars passed on the streets. Porch lights clicked off one by one until only the moonlight and scattered fireflies kept the dark company. From up high in his lair, Heinz felt suspended from it all, like a quiet observer looking down at a city tucked under its own blanket. He tilted his head back, closing his eyes for a moment. Images from earlier in the day flickered across his mind. Blue sparks from an invention short-circuiting, Perry's familiar chattering glare, the faint smell of smoke after an explosion. But instead of spiraling into frustration, the memories softened into faint echoes, like drawings fading on old paper. He could almost laugh at them now. It wasn't so bad, he admitted to himself, his voice thick with drowsiness. Today could have been worse. At least no giant rubber band ball rolled over the Lair. That's progress. Another creak from the chair accompanied his shifting weight as he snuggled deeper under the blanket. He rubbed his hands together for warmth, then let them rest against his stomach, rising and falling with each slow breath. For a man so often wound tight with plans and problems, the surrender to stillness felt new, strange but good. He noticed the lamp flicker once as if debating whether to stay on. The golden light tremble, casting the shadows into a soft dance across the walls. Heinz whispered to it like one might to a pet. "Stay with me a little longer, lamp. Tomorrow you can rest. Tonight, we enjoy the glow together." And so the little lamp held on, its beam steadying again. The room was bathed once more in amber warmth, wrapping every odd invention, crooked shelf, and weary scientist in a shared hush. Doofenshmirtz exhaled through his nose, the sound long and low, like the release of tension that had sat in his chest for years. He let his mind drift without direction, allowing small fragments of thought to rise and fall. He wondered briefly if Vanessa was at home already asleep, her headphones buzzing faint music as she dreamed. He wondered if Perry was curled up somewhere in a tiny bed, perhaps even snoring. He wondered if anyone in the tri-state area at this very moment thought kindly of him. The thoughts weren't bitter tonight. They didn't sting. They simply passed through, like clouds across the moon. Heinz didn't try to hold them or push them away. He just let them come and go, carried on the quiet rhythm of night. He murmured, half smiling. This is not so bad. I could get used to this. His eyelids drooped lower, his chin resting against the collar of his lab coat. The warmth of the blanket, the steady hum of the fridge, the golden glow of the lamp, it all conspired gently to coax him further toward rest. The hour grew late, though time inside the lair seemed to move differently. The clock still ticked in its patient rhythm, but Heinz barely noticed it now. His thoughts had slowed into long, gentle stretches like ripples, spreading out on still water. The frantic bursts of energy that normally defined his evenings had given way to something rare and unfamiliar, calm contentment. He reached over to the desk and picked up the mug again, forgetting it was empty. The cool porcelain pressed lightly against his fingers, and he smiled at the simple comfort of holding it. "You did your job, T," he whispered, setting it back down with care. His voice was nearly swallowed by the hush of the room, but the act of speaking reassured him, like he wasn't entirely alone. The llama blanket slipped slightly from his shoulder, and he tugged it back up, cocooning himself tightly. The fabric brushed his cheek, soft and warm, carrying the faint smell of lavender detergent. He sank deeper into the chair, letting its squeak accompany his shifting weight like a lullaby. His long legs stretched out, slippers dangling lazily at the ends of his feet, one nearly slipping off. For a moment he simply listened. The hum of the fridge, the faint rattle of the window as the breeze moved it. Somewhere below, a car door shut, then silence again. These weren't the sounds of danger or invention. They were the sounds of a world at rest, and they seeped into him like gentle reminders that he too could rest. His gaze drifted back to the ceiling. That stubborn glow-in-the-dark star still clung there, flickering faintly against the dark. Heinz squinted at it, then gave a sleepy grin. "Still hanging on, huh? Good for you. If a tiny sticker can survive on the ceiling all these years, maybe I can make it through another day too. You are motivational, little star. Motivational. And sticky." The words dissolved into a chuckle, though his voice was already thick with drowsiness. He let his head rest against the back of the chair, feeling the gentle pull of gravity coax him lower. His eyelids fluttered, heavy, half-closing until the lamplight blurred into a soft halo. He thought of tomorrow briefly, the unfinished gadgets, the lonely plant waiting for water, the possibility of Perry showing up at an inconvenient hour. Normally those thoughts would have ignited restless energy, but tonight they folded neatly into the background, postponed without guilt. The future could wait. The night asked only for rest. Tomorrow. "I'll fix everything tomorrow," he mumbled, though even he didn't seem convinced. His voice had dropped to a low murmur, the edges of words slurring slightly. The lamp cast its steady glow over him, reflecting in the gentle lines of his face. For once, those lines did not deepen with worry or exaggeration. They softened, smoothed by the quiet acceptance of the moment. The scientist who so often thrashed against the world now looked at last like any tired soul finding comfort in the end of a long day. He shifted one last time, tucking the blanket tighter around himself, letting his head fall slightly to the side. His breathing steadied, long and even, syncing once again with the tick-tock of the clock. In that rhythm, he found a peace he rarely allowed himself to feel. The Lair joined him in this stillness. The shelves sat patiently. The inventions slept in their unfinished state. Even the refrigerator's hum seemed gentler, as though lowering its tone to lull its owner into slumber. The entire space, which so often throbbed with chaotic energy, had transformed into something tender, a refuge for rest. Heinz let out a final sigh, not one of frustration, but of release. His lips curled faintly upward, as though the corners of a dream had already begun to tug at him. The city outside blinked quietly. Stars overhead kept watch, and inside his crooked tower, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz surrendered to the simplest, most elusive invention of all, sleep. The night deepened, and the Lair seemed to sink further into quiet. The lamp still burned faintly on the desk, though its light had softened, spreading a dim golden haze across the room. Doofenshmirtz, nestled beneath his llama blanket, stirred slightly in his chair. His eyes, though heavy, blinked open once more. Sleep had not quite claimed him yet. Instead, his thoughts drifted the way they often did when silence grew long, wandering back into memory. But these memories felt different than the ones he shared during his usual grand speeches. Without an audience, without the need for dramatic flair, they arrived softer, gentler, not tales to impress or exaggerate, but simple fragments of a past he carried quietly within himself. He rubbed at his temple with one hand, his gaze unfocused as he muttered, "You know, Heinz, you never did have the usual kind of childhood. Not like the ones you see in movies where families go camping or play board games. No. Yours was always a little strange. But still, there were moments, little ones." His voice trailed into silence again, replaced by the hum of the fridge and the faint rustle of curtains shifting with the breeze. He thought of his village, the cobblestone streets, the little bakery that always smelled of strudel, the narrow houses that leaned together as though they needed one another to stay standing. In his mind, those streets were bathed in twilight, just like the city outside now. He could almost hear the sound of the church bell, the way it echoed lazily through the valley at dusk. "I used to sit on the steps outside the bakery sometimes," he murmured, "because even if they didn't let me inside, the smell would drift out, warm, sweet. It made me feel safe, like maybe the world wasn't all bad after all." A smile flickered across his face, faint but genuine. The thought rolled into another. He remembered lying in bed as a child, staring up at a cracked ceiling much like the one he gazed at now. He didn't have a blanket then, not a proper one, but he remembered pulling his coat around him and imagining it was something softer, heavier, protective. "Maybe," he whispered, "maybe that's why I like this llama blanket so much. Maybe it's the blanket I always wished I had." His voice had grown quieter, almost like he was speaking not to himself, but to the memory of the boy he once was. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the images gather. The smell of fresh bread, the cold stone steps beneath him, the sound of wind sweeping across narrow alleys. None of these memories were perfect, but in the silence of the Lair they seemed gentle, a softer shade of a life that had often felt too sharp. When he opened his eyes again, they rested on the framed photo of Vanessa. Her smile, caught in a rare, candid moment from years ago, glimmered faintly in the lamplight. He studied it for a long time, the way her hair fell across her shoulders, the way her eyes carried the same sharpness as his own, but softened by youth. "Vanessa," he whispered, almost like a lullaby, "I hope you're having better nights than me. I hope your blanket is warmer than mine, and your tea tastes sweeter. That's what fathers are supposed to wish for, isn't it?" He chuckled softly at himself, shaking his head. "Listen to me. Getting sentimental at midnight. That's not very evil, Heinz." Still, the warmth lingered, and as his gaze drifted back toward the window and the quiet city beyond, he felt that perhaps being sentimental wasn't so bad after all. Doofenshmirtz shifted in his chair, pulling the llama blanket closer around his shoulders. His tea mug sat empty now, but he still cupped it with both hands as if the memory of warmth lingered in the porcelain. The soft lamplight flickered faintly, brushing against the edges of his cluttered workbench, where inventions sat like harmless sculptures waiting for attention. His thoughts continued their quiet wandering. "You know," he said softly, "people always laugh when I tell them about my tragic childhood. But not everything was bad. There were peaceful moments, too. Strange ones, but still peaceful." He leaned his head back and eyes half closed, and let the memories unfurl like a bedtime story meant only for himself. He remembered lying on the hill just outside his village. He had gone there often as a boy, usually after some unfortunate event, a prank gone wrong, a toy taken away, or the endless tasks his family had found for him. The hill was steep and covered with long grass that tickled his necks, but it gave him the one thing he craved: space. From the top he could see the valley stretch out below, dotted with little roofs and curling trails of smoke from chimneys. Above him, the stars scattered themselves across the night in thousands of pinpricks. He smiled faintly, recalling how he would try to count them, always losing track somewhere in the hundreds. "I never did get past 320, he muttered, his lips twitching. 321, then poof, gone. Start again. But it didn't matter. I liked starting again. The night sky, he remembered, was like a blanket of its own, vast, cool, endless. It made him feel small, yes, but not in a bad way. Small in a way that meant his problems could shrink, too. He let that memory drift through him now, the feeling of grass against his skin, the smell of earth, the sound of crickets echoing in the distance. "Maybe that's why I talk so much now," he mused. "Because back then, it was just me and the stars, and they never talked back." The words hung in the air for a moment, then melted into silence. His eyes turned once again to the photo of Vanessa. The frame leaned slightly against a jar of spare bolts, out of place yet somehow fitting. He studied her smile, the way her eyes glimmered with amusement in that captured moment. A pang of tenderness filled him, and he whispered, "When you were little, I wanted to show you those stars. But we never went back, did we? I never made the time." His voice faltered, but only briefly. Then he softened. "Maybe you didn't need to. Maybe you already found your own." He adjusted the blanket again, sinking deeper into his chair. The hum of the refrigerator blended with the tick of the clock, both sounds lulling him like background music. He realized with some surprise that the silence didn't feel lonely tonight. It felt companionable, as though the Lair itself had joined him in remembering. He glanced at the half-built Sleep-inator and chuckled. "Funny thing, though. I spent so much of my life trying to invent ways to control everything. Sleep, weather, people, you name it. And yet the best moments I ever had were the ones I couldn't control, sitting on a hill, smelling strudel I wasn't allowed to eat, watching Vanessa laugh when she thought I wasn't looking." His chuckle turned into a sigh, soft but content. "Maybe that's what peace is. Not controlling, not scheming, just noticing. Letting the world happen, even if it's crooked and unfair. He let that idea rest in his chest, heavy but comforting, as the night stretched quietly onward. The silence of the lair had grown thick, but not in an oppressive way. It was the kind of silence that cradled every sound, so that even the smallest shift carried meaning. The creak of Doofenshmirtz's chair as he leaned back, the faint whistle of the wind outside the window, the rhythmic tick of the clock on the wall, all of it came together like a lullaby, wrapping the lair in its own quiet rhythm. Doofenshmirtz exhaled a long, slow breath and let his head rest against the chair's backrest. His eyes flickered toward the ceiling, where shadows danced gently across the plaster. "You know," he murmured softly, "I used to think silence was dangerous, that it meant no one was there, that if things were too quiet, something bad must be waiting to happen. But maybe it's not so bad. Maybe silence is just another way of saying you're safe for now." He smiled faintly at his own words, surprised at their softness. His mind, ever restless, turned once more to memory. He thought of his early days in America, arriving with little more than a suitcase and far too many strange ideas. Everything had seemed enormous then. The streets, the buildings, the noise of it all. But what he remembered most vividly was the first quiet night in his tiny apartment. No bustling family, no crowded village, no constant demands, just him and the hum of a radiator. I was lonely, he admitted quietly, but also free. It was the first time I realized that quiet could belong to me, not just happen around me. The memory lingered, glowing gently in the lamplight of his mind. He shifted again, pulling the llama blanket up to his chin. The warmth seeped into his skin, reminding him of another small comfort. He remembered the first winter he spent with Vanessa as a toddler. She had crawled into his lap one evening, clutching a stuffed toy almost as large as she was, and fallen asleep instantly. He had been too nervous to move, too afraid to wake her. So he had just sat there, frozen, as the hours passed. But the quiet weight of her breathing, the tiny warmth of her resting against him, it had been the most calming silence he had ever known. "Funny," he whispered with a chuckle, "that even a so-called evil scientist can be defeated by a toddler's nap." The sound of his own laughter faded into the stillness, leaving behind a tender ache in his chest. His eyes moved back to the inventions scattered on the table. Each one carried a story, an idea born from frustration, from longing, from trying to fill a gap that life had left. But tonight they seemed more like ornaments, harmless curiosities that cluttered his shelves without demand. "All those inventions," he said softly. "And yet none of them ever built me the thing I wanted most. Peace. Belonging. A place where silence feels kind." For a moment he sat with that thought, the truth of it sinking in gently. But then his smile returned. "But maybe," he continued, "I don't need to invent it. Maybe it's already here. Maybe it's been here all along, waiting for me to notice." He let the blanket settle heavier across him, his body finally relaxing into the chair. The stillness no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like presence, the kind of presence that didn't need to say anything to be understood. And so, for the first time in a long while, Doofenshmirtz closed his eyes not out of weariness, but out of ease. The lair felt different now. It wasn't just a laboratory brimming with scattered wires, broken prototypes, and half-labeled boxes. Tonight it seemed softer somehow, as though the shadows had pulled back their sharpness, leaving behind only the gentle suggestion of shapes. Even the cold metal beams overhead seemed less rigid, their edges blurred by the dim light. Doofenshmirtz shifted again, nestling deeper under the llama blanket. His eyes were closed now, but he continued to speak into the room as if the walls themselves had been waiting all evening to listen. "You know," he murmured, "I think I used to fill every silence with noise because I was afraid of what I might hear inside my own head. It was easier to rant, to invent, to make speeches no one asked for. Easier than just listening. But tonight it doesn't feel so scary." A small pause followed only by the tick of the clock. "In fact," he added, voice softening further, "it almost feels like the silence has been waiting for me. Like it was saying, 'Whenever you're ready, I'll be here.'" He let the words linger, then exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that matched the quiet heartbeat of the Lair itself. Memories floated more gently now, less sharp, more like softened edges of a dream. He remembered the lull of waves from a family trip long ago when he had been too young to build inventions, but old enough to feel out of place. He remembered the crackling of a fireplace he'd once fallen asleep beside, his head on a pillow that smelled faintly of cinnamon. He remembered Vanessa humming absent-mindedly as a teenager while sketching in her notebook, her voice so quiet that it blended into the air like background music. Each recollection felt like a small lantern glowing in the dark, dim but enough to guide him. Doofenshmirtz chuckled under his breath. "Maybe I should build a remember-inator, one that only pulls out the good memories, the cozy ones. No goats, no humiliations, no weird birthdays where I was dressed as a lawn gnome. Just, the quiet." He paused, smiling. "But then again, maybe I don't need an innator for that either. Maybe all I need is this, just sitting here, just being." The room seemed to sigh with him, the air shifting slightly as though in agreement. His eyelids grew heavier, but he fought against sleep for just a little longer, wanting to savor the quiet while it lasted. "You know," he whispered, voice now barely audible, "for someone who's always tried to take over the tri-state area, I think I've finally conquered something better tonight. My own mind, my own silence." And with that he let the thought settle. No follow-up, no joke, no dramatic flourish. Just quiet. The clock ticked on. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a distant car passed along the road, and in the middle of it all, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz sat cocooned in his blanket, body slack, heart steady, eyes finally surrendering to rest. The reflections faded like ripples on water, leaving behind only stillness. The kind of stillness that holds a person not in loneliness, but in peace. The night had grown even deeper when Doofenshmirtz stirred again. He hadn't drifted entirely into sleep, just brushed against the edge of it. That soft, in-between place where the body rests, but the mind still wanders. His chair creaked softly as he adjusted under the llama blanket. The lamplight flickered faintly, almost ready to burn itself out, and the Lair was wrapped in a hushed stillness. That was when he heard it. At first, just the lightest scuffle, like a paw against metal, then the almost imperceptible sound of claws clicking softly on the tile floor. Doofenshmirtz's brow furrowed. He knew that sound. He had heard it countless times, often followed by a crash, a struggle, and some elaborate defeat. But tonight, it arrived differently, quieter, gentler. Slowly, Doofenshmirtz sat up, tugging the blanket closer around his shoulders. His eyes moved toward the doorway of the lab, and there, in the soft glow of the lamp, stood a familiar teal figure. Perry the platypus. The little agent wasn't wearing his hat tonight. He looked smaller somehow without it, more like the pet version that most people knew him as. His eyes blinked slowly, glimmering in the dim light, and his tail swished against the floor with a lazy rhythm. "Perry the platypus," Doofenshmirtz whispered, his voice not carrying its usual dramatic lilt. What are you doing here at this hour? Shouldn't you be, I don't know, in your secret lair or sleeping in a cozy little platypus bed?" Perry tilted his head slightly as if the question itself was curious. Then, without a sound, he padded softly across the room. His small claws clicked gently with each step, but it wasn't the stomp of confrontation. It was something quieter, almost friendly. Doofenshmirtz blinked, uncertain. Normally, this was the part where an invention was destroyed, a trap was sprung, or a comical tussle unfolded. But there was no invention running tonight, no evil scheme to stop. Just an old scientist wrapped in a blanket, and a platypus who, strangely, looked as though he belonged here. As Perry reached the chair, he paused. His eyes lifted, meeting Doofenshmirtz. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet between them carried more weight than any fight they had ever staged. Then, with surprising grace, Perry hopped up onto the edge of the desk, careful not to disturb the clutter of tools and half-finished devices. Doofenshmirtz's lips twitched into a smile. "You know, it's funny. I spend half my life building things to keep you out. And here you are, invited by nothing but silence. No alarms, no lasers, no traps, just walking right in." Perry gave a low, soft trill in response, one of those sounds that wasn't quite a chirp, not quite a growl, but somewhere in between. It was calm, almost soothing. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, shaking his head. "I must really be tired if I'm imagining friendly visits from my nemesis. Next thing you know, I'll be dreaming that we're, I don't know, playing board games together or knitting matching scarves." He chuckled lightly, but the sound didn't break the stillness. Instead, it melted into it. Perry settled onto the desk, curling his tail around himself. He didn't look like he was here for a mission. He looked like he was simply keeping company. Doofenshmirtz let his eyes linger on the platypus. Something about the sight stirred a quiet warmth in his chest. "You know, Perry, maybe I never said it out loud, but I think I like having you around. Not just for the fights. Those are fun, sure, but it's more than that. When you show up, it feels like someone noticed me, like I matter enough to be stopped. That's not nothing, you know." Perry blinked slowly again, as if acknowledging the words without needing to respond. Doofenshmirtz sighed softly, resting his chin in his hand. Strange, isn't it? The villain and the hero, but in the quiet, without the explosions and the yelling, we're just two creatures sitting in the same room. I don't think that's so bad. And as the lamplight flickered one more time, casting long shadows across the walls, the lair felt less like a lonely place and more like a space that had finally welcomed a guest. Doofenshmirtz shifted in his chair, pulling the llama blanket higher over his shoulders. The lamp on his desk had dimmed to a softer glow, more golden than bright, and it gave the room a warmth that it rarely had during the day. Perry, still perched comfortably on the desk, tilted his head and let out another quiet trill, as if to say, "Yes, I'm here. And no, I'm not leaving yet." The sound made Doofenshmirtz smile, but instead of answering right away, he let himself listen to the silence that followed. The lair had always been full of noises, beeping machinery, sparking wires, the occasional dramatic announcement from a half-working speaker. But tonight all of that seemed to fade into the background. All that remained was the slow tick of the wall clock and the platypus's steady breathing. "You know," Doofenshmirtz said after a pause, "I used to think silence was terrifying. Back when I was a kid in Gimmelstump, Silence usually meant something bad was about to happen, like, oh no, is Father going to put me outside again, or is the lawn gnome staring at me from the shadows? But this silence, it doesn't feel scary. It feels safe. I don't think I've ever thought of silence as safe before. He adjusted in the chair, and the blanket rustled softly. Perry watched, his eyes half-lidded, as though he too were sinking into the calm of the evening. Doofenshmirtz continued, his voice softer now. When you think about it, Perry, most of my life has been noise. Noise from people not listening. Noise from my own inventions blowing up. Noise from me yelling about how unfair everything is. But tonight, I think I finally get why people sit by campfires or listen to waves or whatever. It's not about the sound, it's about the quiet underneath it all. The kind of quiet that holds you instead of leaving you alone. Perry's tail twitched gently, brushing the desk with a faint thump. His gaze didn't waver from Doofenshmirtz, and in that gaze was something that almost felt like understanding. The scientist leaned forward a little, lowering his voice as though confessing a secret. Sometimes I wonder if you get lonely too. I mean, you're always working. Secret missions, gadgets, sneaking around in little tunnels. Does anyone ever sit with you when it's quiet? Or do you just curl up alone when the day is over? Perry blinked slowly. He didn't answer, of course, but the way he shifted, tucking his paws closer under himself, made it look like the question had settled somewhere in him. You're a good listener, you know that? Doofenshmirtz said after a beat. Better than most people. You don't interrupt. You don't argue. You just sit there and let me ramble. He chuckled quietly. Maybe that's why I talk so much when you're around. I finally feel like someone is actually hearing me. For a long stretch of minutes, neither of them moved much. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, closing his eyes while Perry remained curled on the desk. The platypus's breathing was steady, almost rhythmic, and the sound joined the ticking clock as part of the Lair's new lullaby. Eventually, Doofenshmirtz opened one eye and glanced over. You know, if anyone else saw us like this, they'd probably laugh. The evil scientist and the secret agent platypus just hanging out. Not fighting, not chasing, not blowing anything up. Just two old friends? He hesitated on the word, but didn't take it back. Yeah, friends. His voice softened even further, nearly a whisper. Maybe that's what tonight is. Not about schemes or failures or even redemption, just sharing the quiet with someone who understands it too. The Lair, once a place of noise and chaos, now held them both in a gentle stillness. The moment stretched like warm fabric, soft and unbroken, until it felt less like an interruption of their usual roles, and more like something that had always been meant to happen. Doofenshmirtz rubbed his eyes slowly, not from exhaustion this time, but from a strange heaviness that felt more like comfort than weariness. He shifted in the chair, the blanket slipping down one arm, and for a moment he just watched Perry sitting so calmly on the desk. The platypus had closed his eyes, his breathing steady, his little chest rising and falling, with the rhythm of someone who trusted their surroundings enough to let their guard down. The sight caught Doofenshmirtz off guard. Perry, his nemesis, the one who had foiled countless inventions, sitting there so peacefully as though he had nothing to fear in this lair. It made the scientist's voice soften even further when he finally spoke. You know, Perry, I think I've been looking at this whole thing wrong. Perry's ear twitched at the sound of his name, though he didn't open his eyes. I've always thought of you as the obstacle, Doofenshmirtz continued, resting his chin on his hand. The thing that stood between me and, well, world domination, or at least the tri-state area domination. But maybe Maybe you're not the obstacle. Maybe you're the anchor." He paused, letting the words settle. "Because if you weren't there to stop me, I'd just keep going, keep building, keep scheming, keep yelling at the universe. I'd wear myself out until there was nothing left of me. But with you, it's like you remind me that someone's paying attention, that someone is willing to wrestle me back into place when I start flying too close to the sun." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course I'd never admit this during one of our fights. Oh no, then it's all curse you, Perry the platypus, and dramatic fist shaking. But here now, I can say it. You keep me human, Perry. You keep me grounded." The platypus's tail flicked lightly against the desk, a sound so small that it barely rose above the clock's ticking. But it felt like agreement, or at least acknowledgement. Doofenshmirtz leaned back again, his gaze drifting toward the ceiling. "It's funny. I used to think that the worst part of life was being ignored, being invisible. I built all these inventions just to make sure people would notice me. Loud inventions, big explosions, dramatic schemes. But now I think maybe being noticed quietly is better, like tonight. You didn't barge in. You didn't yell or smash anything. You just showed up, sat down, and that was enough. That's more than enough." For a moment, silence returned, gentle and weightless. The only movement was the soft flicker of the lamp and the steady rhythm of Perry's breath. "You know," Doofenshmirtz said finally, "if I were a different kind of person, maybe I'd say thank you. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for not letting me vanish into the noise, but don't let it go to your head, all right? I still have a reputation to keep." He smirked faintly. Perry opened one eye, gave a soft chirr, and then closed it again as if to humor him. The sight made Doofenshmirtz's chest warm in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. "Look at us," he whispered. "The great villain and his nemesis, sitting in the same room, wrapped in silence like it's the rarest treasure in the world. Maybe it is. Maybe quiet company is the one thing we all chase without even knowing it." The minutes stretched on, peaceful and unhurried. For once, Doofenshmirtz didn't feel the urge to fill them with more words. He simply let the silence cradle them both, until it felt less like an absence and more like the presence of something deeper. Connection, unspoken but undeniable. The night had grown deeper, though neither Doofenshmirtz nor Perry seemed to notice at first. Outside the Lair's windows, the city's glow softened into faint halos of light, as though the world itself was preparing for rest. Inside, the lamp on the desk cast its final pool of gold, holding them in its gentle circle as if refusing to let the quiet moment fade too quickly. Doofenshmirtz gave a long, slow sigh, not the kind laced with frustration or defeat, but the kind that comes when the heart finally feels lighter. He adjusted the llama blanket once more, tucking it close around his shoulders, and glanced at Perry. The platypus had dozed off halfway, his little form curled up neatly on the desk. His breaths were deep and steady, the kind that lulled anyone nearby toward sleep without even trying. For a long time, Doofenshmirtz simply watched. He didn't feel the need to move or to talk or to break the spell. Instead, he let the silence stretch, realizing that this quiet companionship was rarer than any invention he could ever build. Eventually, he whispered, almost to himself, "You know, Perry, I think tonight has been one of the best nights I can remember, not because of anything grand, but because, well, it didn't need to be grand. It was just enough." The words hung in the air, soft and fragile. Perry stirred faintly, his tail twitching, but he didn't wake. His steady breathing continued, weaving into the room like the background music of peace itself. Doofenshmirtz leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Maybe that's the secret, huh? Maybe life isn't about conquering the tri-state area, or making sure people know your name, or even proving anything. Maybe it's about finding the moments where you're not alone, where you can sit in the quiet, and for once, you don't feel like you're missing anything. A small smile crept onto his face, and for the first time in what felt like years, it wasn't tinged with irony or bitterness. It was simple, genuine. The ticking clock marked the passing seconds, each one blending seamlessly into the next. The Lair, so often chaotic and filled with the whir of machinery, had transformed into something unexpected, a place of rest. And for once, Doofenshmirtz didn't fight the pull of drowsiness. His eyelids grew heavy, his thoughts slowed, and the warmth of the blanket combined with the quiet companionship of Perry to lull him toward sleep. Before he drifted completely, he murmured, "Don't tell anyone about this, all right? Just between us." The great Dr. Doofenshmirtz and his nemesis, sharing a peaceful night. If people found out, they'd think I'd gone soft. He chuckled softly, the sound fading into a yawn. But maybe soft isn't so bad. Perry gave one last small trill in his sleep, as if to agree, and then all was quiet again. The Lair settled fully into stillness. No beeping machines, no dramatic speeches, no interruptions. Just the steady rhythm of two unlikely companions breathing in the same space, held together by the kind of silence that didn't feel empty, but whole. And as sleep finally took Doofenshmirtz, the night carried them both gently, like a lullaby sung without words, into the kind of dreams that only come when one is not truly alone. The first blush of dawn was still hours away, yet inside Doofenshmirtz's lair, the atmosphere had shifted again. The quiet night Perry had brought had left its mark, softening the edges of Doofenshmirtz's restless mind. But as the inventor slowly woke from his light doze, still wrapped in his blanket, a familiar itch began to return, the itch to invent. Doofenshmirtz blinked blearily at the desk, where Perry still dozed peacefully. He rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Huh, he's still here. My nemesis, sleeping on my desk. I mean, what a twist, right? Who would have guessed this would be my Friday night?" His gaze shifted to the corner of the lair where unused parts and half-finished devices rested in quiet stacks. Normally, those piles screamed of deadlines, plans, and frustration. Tonight, however, they looked different, like possibilities waiting to be gently reshaped. He straightened a little in his chair, the blanket slipping, and murmured, "You know what this night needs? An innator. But not just any innator. No, no, no. This calls for something peaceful." He tapped his chin thoughtfully, eyes narrowing with a mix of theatrical seriousness and sleepy softness. "A sleep-inator." The words felt strange coming from his mouth. Usually his inventions leaned toward destruction, inconvenience, or at the very least, dramatic declarations of mild annoyance. But the idea of an innator built solely for rest, it sparked something different in him. "Imagine it, Perry," he whispered, careful not to disturb the platypus. "A ray that doesn't destroy, doesn't shrink, doesn't even mildly irritate. Instead, it makes people cozy, like impossibly cozy. Imagine the entire tri-state area just taking a nap at the same time. No yelling, no arguing, no cutting in line at the slushy machine. Just quiet breathing, synchronized snoring. Oh, it would be beautiful." He smiled dreamily at the thought. For once, the fantasy didn't involve triumph or revenge. It involved peace, something he had long chased without realizing it. He pushed himself out of the chair, careful not to jostle Perry, and shuffled over to the pile of parts. His blanket trailed behind him like a cape, though far less dramatic than his usual villain attire. He dug through the components, coils, tubes, wires, a half-empty box of bolts, even a dusty pillow he had accidentally glued to a circuit board weeks ago. "Huh, this could work," he said softly, gathering pieces with surprising care. He carried them to the workbench and began to assemble them, not with his usual frantic energy, but with deliberate slowness. The steady clink of metal and the occasional sigh filled the room, a quiet rhythm that almost matched Perry's breathing. As the device began to take shape, he spoke more to himself than anyone else. "It needs to be gentle. No harsh, zapping sounds, no sparks flying everywhere. Just a soft whoosh. Maybe a lullaby tone? Yes, that would be nice. Something soothing, like a grandmother humming you to sleep." He paused and smiled faintly. "Not that I would know what that sounds like, but you know. Imagination." He screwed in the final piece of the base, sat back, and admired the beginnings of his creation. The Sleep-inator, though far from complete, already looked different from his usual machines. Instead of jagged angles and intimidating spikes, it had rounded edges, softer curves, and even a small, glowing orb at its center that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Wow," Doofenshmirtz whispered. "This one's kind of pretty." Behind him, Perry stirred, opening one eye to glance at the inventor. Doofenshmirtz caught the look and grinned sheepishly. "Don't give me that face, Perry. Even villains can appreciate aesthetics." The platypus gave a quiet trill before curling back into his nap. Doofenshmirtz turned back to his invention, his voice lowering to a murmur. "Maybe this is the invention I was always supposed to build. Something not meant to impress or conquer, but to rest, to make the world slow down, just for a little while. Because, let's face it, Perry, the world runs too fast. People shout, they rush, they fight. But maybe, just maybe, if everyone could pause for a nap, things wouldn't feel so heavy." His hand lingered on the machine's glowing orb, the warmth of it reflecting in his eyes. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't inventing to be noticed. He was inventing because he wanted peace. For himself, for Perry, maybe even for everyone else. And in the quiet Lair, with the city outside growing ever stiller, the beginnings of the Sleep-inator glowed softly, like a beacon of rest yet to come. The Lair seemed unusually quiet as Doofenshmirtz continued to work. The Sleep-inator was slowly transforming from a pile of mismatched parts into something recognizable, though admittedly it still bore the odd charm of all his inventions, wires sticking out at odd angles, a knob labeled mystery setting, and a switch that probably didn't need to exist, but looked impressive anyway. Doofenshmirtz tightened a bolt and then sat back, holding his wrench thoughtfully. "You know," he mused softly, "it's funny. I've built inators to freeze, shrink, explode, even mildly inconvenience people. But I've never built one that would just help, like no strings attached, just a nap button for life." He gave a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Of course, I probably should have done this years ago. Think of how many stress-induced arguments at the grocery store could have been avoided. You wouldn't have angry customers fighting over the last jar of mustard. No, they'd all be snoozing happily in the condiment aisle." He snorted quietly at the mental image, but there was a strange warmth in the joke, too. He realized, as he tightened another screw, that this was the first time he wasn't imagining chaos as the result of his work, but calm. Behind him, Perry stirred again, lifting his head briefly to watch. The platypus made no move to interfere, he simply observed. Normally, by now, he would have launched into a full-on mission of sabotage, diving into battle with acrobatics and gadgets. But something in Doofenshmirtz's manner was different. There was no dramatic monologue, no evil laugh, just soft tinkering, like someone fixing a music box. "Don't worry, Perry," Doofenshmirtz said gently, noticing the look. "This isn't one of my usual, schemes. I mean, sure, it's technically still an inventor, but this one's not for taking over the tri-state area. It's more like, well, taking over insomnia, and that, my nemesis, is a cause worth fighting for." Perry blinked slowly, then let out a quiet sound that was almost approving. He curled back into his spot, seemingly at ease. Doofenshmirtz smiled faintly. "See? Even you get it. You spent how many years chasing me, fighting, climbing through elaborate traps. You must be tired, too. Honestly, Perry, we're not enemies tonight. We're, well, roommates in the land of exhaustion." He placed the last piece onto the frame and flicked the switch. The orb at the center glowed brighter, pulsing in soft waves of golden light. It wasn't harsh or overwhelming. It shimmered gently, like the flicker of fireflies on a summer evening. The machine hummed faintly, and instead of the usual sputtering or sparking, it released a low melodic tone, almost like a lullaby without words. Doofenshmirtz's eyes widened. Oh, wow, that's actually nice. Did I just invent something pleasant?" He sat back, stunned for a moment, then he began nodding vigorously. Yes, I did. It's like a bedtime ray, a relaxation beam up." He paused, shaking his head with a small smile. No, keep it simple. Sleep-inator. Stick with what works." He leaned closer to the device, lowering his voice as though afraid to break the moment. "It's peaceful. Really peaceful. You know, Perry, I don't think I've ever sat next to one of my inventions and just breathed like this. Usually there are sparks, explosions, chaos. But this feels like it was made for silence." The hum of the Sleep-inator filled the lair, not as noise, but as atmosphere. It wrapped around the inventor and the platypus like a soft blanket of sound, complementing the glow of the orb. For once, the lair didn't feel like a villain's den. It felt like a sanctuary. Doofenshmirtz rested his elbows on the table, chin in his hands, gazing at the machine. Maybe the tri-state area doesn't need conquering. Maybe it just needs a nap. And maybe I need one too. He stifled a yawn, the irony not lost on him. The Sleep-inator was working already, if not on the world, and certainly on him. And for the first time in a long while, Doofenshmirtz wondered if this was what real invention was supposed to feel like. Not about power, but about peace. Doofenshmirtz sat for a long moment, chin propped on his hand, staring at the glowing orb of the Sleep-inator. The soft hum filled the lair, and for once, he didn't feel compelled to leap up and declare some villainous plot. Instead, he felt calm, so calm, in fact, that his eyelids fluttered heavily for a second before he forced them back open. "Oh, okay," he mumbled, rubbing his face. Note to self, do not test the Sleep-inator on yourself without, I don't know, safety goggles or a very strong cup of coffee. Perry gave a quiet, questioning chirp from the desk. He hadn't moved much, though one eye peeked open. He tilted his head as though to say, "So what now?" Doofenshmirtz pointed toward the machine. "Well, Perry, the logical next step is to test it. I mean, you can't just build something and then not try it. That's like rule number 1 of inventing, or maybe rule number 2. Rule number 1 is always label your self-destruct button. Trust me, you don't want to mix those up with your microwave timer." He stood stretching and shuffled over to a section of the lair where he usually tested his inventions. The space was still littered with scorch marks and broken contraptions from past failures, But tonight, the atmosphere was different. Instead of bracing himself for disaster, he felt strangely hopeful. He looked back at Perry, who was now sitting up fully, watching with his usual mix of wariness and patience. "Oh, don't give me that look. This isn't going to be one of those, oh, oops, I blew up half the Lair nights. No, this is going to be pleasant. I can feel it." He positioned the Sleep-inator on a stand, making sure it faced the testing area. He pulled out a small, somewhat mangled clipboard, flipping through a page of messy notes. "All right, let's see. Test subject chair. Yes, I know it's not glamorous, but you have to start somewhere." He dragged an old swivel chair into the center of the floor. It wobbled slightly on one leg, but stayed upright. Doofenshmirtz adjusted his goggles, flicked a couple of switches, and then, with an exaggerated flourish, pulled the activation lever. The orb pulsed brighter, and a soft beam of golden light washed over the chair. Instead of sparking or catching fire, as many of his tests usually did, the chair simply slumped. Its creaky backrest reclined slightly, the cushion flattening as though someone invisible had sunk into it with a sigh. Doofenshmirtz's jaw dropped. "Oh, did you see that, Perry?" The chair relaxed. "I mean, sure, it's an inanimate object, but look at it. It's practically lounging. If that isn't proof this works, I don't know what is." Perry blinked slowly, but seemed quietly impressed. Doofenshmirtz rubbed his hands together, grinning. "All right, phase 2. Something living. Something small, something not me." He glanced around, eyes landing on a houseplant perched on a shelf. "Perfect. Fern test number 1. He carefully set the plant in the beam's path and activated the Sleep-inator again. This time, the golden light bathed the leaves, and to his amazement, the plant's drooping fronds lifted slightly, then slowly settled into an even softer droop, as if the fern itself had sighed contentedly into a nap. Doofenshmirtz clapped his hands together, grinning from ear to ear. Yes. This is it, Perry. This is my magnum opus. Forget evil plans, forget tri-state domination. This is my legacy. Doofenshmirtz, bringer of naps." He spun dramatically, arms wide. "The newspapers will write about it. Local evil scientist accidentally ends world stress crisis. Children will cheer, parents will applaud, cats will purr in synchronization." Perry rolled his eyes, but his beak twitched in the faintest suggestion of amusement. Doofenshmirtz turned back to the machine, his smile softening. "But maybe this isn't about the newspapers. Maybe it's about me. About finally making something that doesn't break people's trust, or cause chaos, or make me look ridiculous. Something that actually helps." He paused, staring at the beam of light as it faded. His voice lowered. "You know, Perry, I spent most of my life thinking the only way I'd ever matter was if I forced people to notice me. That's why I built inventions that shouted, that exploded, that demanded attention. But maybe people don't need another loud thing. Maybe they need quiet. And maybe so do I." The platypus gave a soft sound, something between a trill and a sigh. Doofenshmirtz chuckled softly, blinking away a suspicious hint of moisture in his eyes. "Don't go getting sentimental on me, Perry. I'm still technically your nemesis, remember? But thanks for sticking around tonight. It's nice not being alone with this." The Sleep-inator pulsed faintly again, filling the Lair with that golden glow, and as the light touched both inventor and nemesis, the silence that followed didn't feel empty. It felt whole. Doofenshmirtz stood in front of the Sleep-inator, hands resting on his hips, his expression caught between pride and disbelief. The machine glowed steadily, casting a golden shimmer across the Lair. For once, he wasn't bracing himself for sparks, for explosions, or for the sound of something catastrophically breaking. Instead, the air felt safe, soft, almost dreamy. He turned to Perry, who was still perched on the desk, watching with steady eyes. "Well, Perry, I think it's time for the real test. And no, before you panic, I don't mean you. I wouldn't point a brand new inventor at my nemesis. What kind of villain do you take me for?" He paused, rubbing his chin. "Well, okay, technically I would. I have. Multiple times. But this one's different." He adjusted a dial on the side of the machine, lowering the intensity. I think maybe I'll try it myself. Just a little. After all, if it's safe enough for a fern, it's safe enough for Heinz Doofenshmirtz. And if it works," his voice softened, "maybe I'll finally sleep through the night." He pulled over a nearby chair and sat down, facing the machine. The glow bathed him, and instantly he felt the weight of years pressing down. Not in a heavy way, but in the way a blanket gently drapes over tired shoulders. His eyelids tremble, the hum of the Sleep-inator syncing with the slow rhythm of his heartbeat. "Oh, wow," he whispered, his voice slurring slightly. "It's like a lullaby for the brain. I can feel the stress. It's just gone." Perry tilted his head, watching carefully. Normally, this would be the point where he'd swoop in, disable the machine, and tie up Doofenshmirtz before reporting back. But tonight, it didn't feel right. There was no evil scheme to stop, no threat looming over the tri-state area. There was just a tired man, finally letting himself rest. Doofenshmirtz blinked at Perry through heavy lids. "You know, Perry, I think I get it now. All those years chasing after attention, after proving I was worth something. Maybe what I really needed was just this, a quiet moment. Someone nearby who doesn't mind sitting in the silence with me." His head lolled back slightly, his words slowing. "It's funny. All this time I thought our rivalry was what gave me purpose. But maybe it was just having company. Even if it was you, Perry the platypus, my oddly reliable nemesis." His voice trailed off into a soft snore. For a moment the Lair was still, lit only by the gentle glow of the machine. Perry remained on the desk, gazing at Doofenshmirtz. He could have taken advantage of the moment, wrapped things up as he always did, but instead he padded quietly across the floor, climbed onto a nearby chair, and settled himself within the warm circle of light. The golden hum wrapped around both of them, carrying the tension of the day away. Perry's eyes drifted shut, his breathing slowing to match Doofenshmirtz's. For once, there was no mission, no gadgets, no dramatic fight. Just two unlikely companions, resting side by side in a moment of peace. The Sleep-inator pulsed softly, like a heart beating steadily into the quiet. It didn't conquer the tri-state area, and it didn't make headlines. But in its glow, an exhausted inventor and his nemesis found something far more important: rest. And in that silence, the Lair didn't feel like a place of schemes or failure. It felt like home. The golden light of the Sleep-inator dimmed into a softer glow, wrapping the Lair in a blanket of warmth and hush. Doofenshmirtz slumped in his chair, chin tilted toward his chest, eyelids fluttering in that slow, heavy rhythm of someone just on the edge of dreams. His voice, however, did not completely vanish. Even in half-sleep he muttered softly, words spilling out like loose marbles rolling down a quiet slope. Perry, you know, when I was a little boy in Gimmelstump, nobody ever told me bedtime stories." His tone was unusually tender, threaded with a drowsy slur. "No, my parents thought the best way to put me to sleep was to make me count wallpaper cracks, And let me tell you, Perry the platypus, cracks are not good storytellers. They don't have character development. They don't have dramatic arcs. They just sit there on the wall, all crackly. He gave a soft chuckle, half a snore, half a laugh. Perry, curled up nearby, tilted an ear but didn't move. Sometimes I wonder, Doofenshmirtz continued, voice lowering into a thoughtful hum. If I had been told bedtime stories, would I have grown up different? Maybe. Maybe instead of becoming an evil scientist, I would have become, I don't know, a professional storyteller. Yes, imagine it. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, world's most beloved bedtime narrator. Children everywhere would drift into dreams as I tell them about goats or shoes, or goats wearing shoes. People love that stuff. He yawned loudly, stretching out his arms before letting them flop against his sides. But no, instead I made innators. Don't get me wrong, Perry, I do love inventing. I love the whirring and the clanking and the occasional kaboom. But sometimes, when I'm honest with myself, I wonder if maybe I just want people to listen to me, to hear me, even if it was because I strapped a giant megaphone onto the moon. His head rolled lazily to one side, eyes closing completely now. The words continued as though they belonged more to his dreams than his waking self. You're a good listener, Perry the platypus. You don't interrupt. You don't laugh at me too much. Well, okay, you give me the look. But that's okay. The look is better than silence. The look means someone's paying attention. The steady hum of the Sleep-inator filled the pause like a lullaby playing beneath his voice. I think that's why I monologue so much. Everybody says, "Oh, Heinz, you talk too much. You explain too much. You go on and on." But maybe, his voice dropped to a whisper, maybe I just want someone there when I talk. Someone who doesn't walk away, even if it's my nemesis in a little fedora. He let out a sleepy laugh. You know, Perry, if I had to pick one thing about our whole nemesis ship, it's that you keep showing up day after day. Even when my inventions are ridiculous, even when they fizzle or explode, you're there, like clockwork, like some reliable platypus-shaped alarm. And he yawned mid-sentence, blinking heavily. And that's kind of comforting. His words slowed, blending into the hum of the machine. So maybe tonight, maybe this is my bedtime story. I talk, you listen, and somewhere in between, we both fall asleep. That doesn't sound so bad, does it? The silence stretched for a moment. Perry adjusted slightly, his head tucking in against his chest. The golden glow shimmered like starlight, spilled across the lair. Doofenshmirtz's voice, now nearly a murmur, added one last sleepy thought. Goats in shoes. Bestseller. Definitely. And with that he drifted deeper into dreams, his breathing evening out, the words slipping away into quiet. The lair was quiet except for the steady hum of the Sleep-inator and the soft rhythm of Doofenshmirtz's voice. His eyes were closed now, his body fully slack in the chair, but his mind wandered in that peculiar way only dreams could allow. His words floated between sense and nonsense, weaving together a monologue that sounded half like memory, half like a bedtime fable. I remember one time when I was 7, he began, his voice trailing like a whispery breeze. My parents told me I had to sleep outside, with the goats. Not because it was some kind of fun camping trip. No, they just said, "Heinz, the goats need company, and you look like someone who can baa convincingly." So there I was, lying in the straw, pretending to baa in my little boy voice. The goats didn't appreciate it. They headbutted me. Goats are very judgmental creatures, Perry the platypus. He gave a soft huff of laughter, the kind that rises unbidden even in sleep. But you know what's funny? I think maybe that was my first bedtime story. Not a story told to me, but a story I had to live. A strange, itchy, sneezy story in a goat pen. And I survived it. And now I tell it to you, and it becomes a bedtime story after all. Isn't that strange? How things circle back. Perry blinked slowly from his perch, the steady glow reflecting in his eyes. He didn't interrupt. He never did. Doofenshmirtz's voice shifted, dreamier now. Sometimes I think of Gimmelstum, the cobblestone streets, the crooked houses, the way the air smelled of cabbage soup and, occasionally, despair. But in dreams, it looks different, softer, like the houses lean because they're tired, not because the builders were lazy. The streets shine a little under the moon. Even the goats wear little pajamas. He chuckled again, a raspy, sleepy sound. Yes, pajama goats. Much less headbutting, much more cuddly. I would have slept better back then if goats had pajamas, everyone would. His voice quieted for a beat. The silence filled with the comforting pulse of the machine. Then, softer still, do you ever dream, Perry the platypus? I wonder what platypuses dream about. Streams? Warm rocks in the sun? Giant clams? Or maybe you dream about this. About being here, listening to a silly man talk himself to sleep. A sigh slipped from him, heavy and content. If you do, then I guess we're sharing the same dream. A dream where I'm not so alone. A dream where someone actually stays. The corners of his mouth curled faintly in a drowsy smile. That's what bedtime should be, not just the sleeping, but the staying, the togetherness. I think maybe I missed out on that as a kid. No one stayed, not even the goats. They always wandered off. He shifted slightly, curling deeper into his blanket. His voice was lower now, rumbling, dream-heavy. But you're still here. Perry the platypus, you stayed. And so, I can stay asleep. The hum of the Sleep-inator deepened, a soothing drone like distant waves. Doofenshmirtz's voice grew softer, almost indistinct, words melting into dream thoughts. And in this dream, there's no evil schemes, no failures, no loneliness, just pajamas, goats in pajamas, and you, listening. The last word lingered in the golden glow, dissolving into silence. Or the Lair seemed to dissolve around him. The humming of the Sleep-inator was steady, but in Doofenshmirtz's drifting mind it transformed into something else, like the low strum of a lullaby played on strings the size of skyscrapers. His breathing was slow and deep, yet his voice kept wandering, tethered half to the room and half to his dreams. Oh, this is strange, he muttered, lips curving in a sleepy smile. The goats in pajamas. They are marching now, a whole parade, Perry, the platypus. Yes, a parade just for me. They have little trumpets and woolly slippers. The slippers make no sound, but the trumpets do. It's very festive. And at the front of the parade is you. You, Perry, wearing a sash that says Nemesis of the Year. His head tilted back slightly, a chuckle bubbling up from his chest. Of course you won. You win every year. They should just engrave your name permanently. But in the dream, you don't fight me. You lead the parade, and everyone claps, and I wave from a float shaped like... Ah, yes, like one of my innators. The bedtime innator, maybe. Sprays lavender mist into the crowd. Nobody boos. They just smile. Can you imagine, Perry? They're happy to see me. That's different. The smile on his lips wavered into something softer and something that carried a trace of longing. Maybe that's what I always wanted. Not domination, not revenge. just to float in a parade, someone to clap when I wave. The dream carried him further. His voice, though hushed, described it like he was narrating for himself. And oh, now the streets of Gimmelstump aren't gloomy anymore. They shine like they're sprinkled with sugar. The crooked houses straighten up a little, as if they know people are watching. Even the clouds are friendly. They puff into shapes. Look, Perry, that one looks like a platypus with a monocle. Distinguished, very distinguished. He yawned mid-sentence, the sound stretching out long and drowsy. You know, Perry, the platypus, he whispered. I think dreams are like editing life. You take the sad parts, the crooked parts, the lonely parts, and you smooth them over. You add pajamas. You add parades. You give yourself the things you didn't get when you were small. And then, maybe you rest a little easier. Silence hung for a few moments. Only the steady hush of the machine filled the air. Then Doofenshmirtz mumbled again, slower this time. Strange thing is, I don't feel like the villain here. Not in the dream. Not when you're leading the parade. Maybe bedtime stories aren't about heroes and villains at all. Maybe they're just about not being alone before sleep. The words trailed into a sigh. His hand twitched slightly as if waving in the dream. Thank you for listening, Perry. Even here. The glow around him pulsed faintly, like the Lair itself was listening too. His voice thinned into a whisper, tangled with the surreal warmth of dreams. Goats in slippers, Perry with a sash, and me waving, not plotting. That's nice. The sentence melted into quiet breathing. The room was nearly silent now, save for the steady lull of the Sleep-inator. Doofenshmirtz's breaths had deepened into that rhythm where wakefulness and dreaming blurred. Yet his voice lingered, fragile and soft, like the very last sparks of a candle before the flame went out. Perry, it's getting quieter, he whispered. His words stumbled over drowsiness, but they pressed on. Not the bad kind of quiet. Not like when I was a boy in my tower room with only the dripping faucet for company. No, this quiet feels warm, like a blanket. Like someone tucked me in and said, "Don't worry, Heinz. I'll stay right here." His head lolled against the chair, and a faint smile ghosted across his face. I never had that before. Not really. No one to guard the room from shadows. No one to tell me the world would wait until morning. But now, with you sitting there, Perry, with your little fedora and your quiet watching, it feels like I have it, even if just this once. The dream tugged harder, painting imagery across his drifting words. The parade fades now. The goats in pajamas are bowing goodnight. The houses in Gimmelstump are blowing out their lanterns. Even the platypus-shaped cloud is yawning, stretching across the sky like a giant pillow. Everything is slowing down, saying, "Rest, rest, it's time." He sighed, long and weightless. Do you know what's funny, Perry the platypus? I think this is my favorite invention. Not the shrinkinator, not the hot dog on a stickinator, not even the giant dispenser of evil lasers inator. No, it's this. The Sleep-inator. Because it doesn't hurt anyone. It doesn't take anything away. It just gives back. It gives sleep. It gives peace. And maybe it even gives me a little piece of what I missed. His voice fell almost to nothing, words slowing like a record winding down. And you gave it to me, too. By staying, by listening, by being here when I talk too much. The last chuckle was broken by a yawn. His eyelids fluttered once, then settled, heavy as stone. Still, the very last fragments of thought slipped free, a childlike confession carried into the dark. Maybe I'm not such a bad guy. Maybe I just needed someone to stay until I fell asleep. A pause. Only breathing now, long and steady. Then faintly, with all the softness of surrender. Good night, Perry the platypus. The lamplight glowed gently, wrapping the lair in a cocoon of amber warmth. Perry sat watchful but calm, his small eyes blinking slowly, like a guardian who understood the value of silence. Doofenshmirtz had finally drifted past the boundary of words, slipping fully into sleep. The machine hummed low, softer now, like it too was ready to rest. The parade, the goats, the pajama clouds, all folded neatly into dreamland. And there among them, Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz slept soundly, his monologue at last dissolved into the language of dreams. The lair had grown softer, as though the very walls themselves had decided to sleep. Shadows stretched like blankets over the corners, and the hum of the Sleep-inator quieted to a gentle throb, steady as a heartbeat. Even the faint buzz of the city outside seemed muted, like the night was showing respect for one tired inventor, finally finding his rest. Doofenshmirtz's chair tilted back slightly, his lanky frame bundled in the llama blanket, chin resting against his chest. His lips moved every so often, but no real words escaped now, only the restless mutterings of someone slipping between dreams and memory. Beside him, Perry the platypus sat, silent and still. He hadn't left even after his nemesis had drifted into sleep. He remained on guard, though the kind of guard that needed no action, just quiet company. The lab was peaceful in a way it rarely was. No sparks flew from inventions, no dramatic shouting echoed through the halls, no alarms blared announcing another failed scheme. Instead, it was filled with the rhythm of rest. The machines lined up against the walls glowed faintly like nightlights. A little puff of steam rose occasionally from the Sleep-inator, releasing the faintest trace of lavender into the air, barely enough to notice but enough to soften the senses. Doof shifted in his chair, sighing softly in his sleep. His dreams were calmer now than they had been earlier. No chaotic parades of goats, no booming crowds or oversized inators rolling down the street. Instead, he seemed to be carried somewhere quieter. Maybe a meadow, maybe a place where childhood shadows could not reach him. His face, usually so animated with scheming or complaining, was slack and peaceful, almost boyish. The crease between his brows had eased. His jaw, so often clenched with frustration, rested loose. Good night, he mumbled into the blanket, though who he was addressing was unclear. Perhaps Perry, perhaps his dream, perhaps the memory of someone who had never tucked him in. The words floated and vanished like smoke. Perry blinked slowly, adjusting his little fedora as he leaned back against a stack of blueprints. He didn't need to understand every word, he simply stayed. He knew in his quiet way that this was what Doofenshmirtz had needed far more than any battle. A night where nothing exploded, no one argued, and sleep wasn't chased away by loneliness. Around the lair, everything seemed to sink to that stillness. A draft crept through the window, cool but not harsh, stirring a hanging blueprint that flapped gently like a curtain. A lone moth drifted lazily past the lamplight, then disappeared into the shadows. Even the moonlight through the glass seemed softened, casting a pale glow over the inventor's blanket. And so the minutes passed, slowly, carefully, quietly. A strange and precious calm for a man whose life had been anything but calm. His chest rose and fell with steady rhythm, a melody far simpler than any of his inventions, but far more valuable. It wasn't victory, not in the traditional sense. There were no medals, no applause, no grand unveiling of an invention that finally worked the way he had planned. But here in the stillness, Doofenshmirtz had found a different sort of triumph, the triumph of rest, and perhaps, without realizing it, the triumph of being cared for, even in silence. The night stretched on, and with it, a promise. For once, sleep would stay. Sleep had taken hold of Dr. Heinz Doofenshmirtz completely now, drawing him into a world woven from fragments of memory, imagination, and quiet longing. The hum of the Sleep-inator followed him into the dreamscape, reshaping itself into something softer, like the purr of a lullaby, sung by a machine that finally understood gentleness. At first his dream was hazy, colored only by pale moonlight and mist. Then shapes began to form, rolling meadows that stretched further than his eyes could see, painted in deep indigo and soft lavender, glowing faintly as if the stars themselves had settled into the grass. Each blade shimmered when the wind touched it, releasing little sparks of starlight that floated upward like fireflies. Doof wandered through the meadow in his dream, barefoot, his lab coat trailing behind him, like a cape that had forgotten its purpose. He looked younger somehow, not in his features, but in his posture. There was less weight on his shoulders, less bitterness etched into his stance. He didn't stumble forward with frustration or stomp with determination. Instead, he walked lightly, as though each step was guided by the earth itself. Off in the distance, he saw a figure, small, teal, unmistakable. Perry the platypus, hat and all, stood quietly in the field, waiting. Doof smiled without hesitation, as though in this dream he had no need for dramatic introductions. "Ah, Perry the platypus," he said, his voice warm, unguarded. "You're here too. Of course you are." The platypus gave his familiar blink, that slow, understanding gesture that carried more weight than words ever could. He didn't attack, didn't prepare for a fight. He simply turned and began to walk, inviting Doof to follow, and he did, without question. Together they moved across the dreamscape. The meadow shifted around them, bending like pages in a storybook. One moment they passed a grove of tall silver trees, whose leaves chimed like wind bells. The next, a quiet brook meandered past their feet, its waters glowing faintly with the constellations instead of stones. The stars themselves seemed to gather in the stream, swirling lazily before drifting back into the sky. And Doofenshmirtz knelt at the brook and dipped his hand into the glowing water. It felt cool and weightless, like liquid moonlight. He laughed softly. "Can you believe it, Perry? A brook that actually sparkles like all those poetic descriptions people talk about. I always thought that was exaggerated, but no, it's real here." Perry tilted his head as if amused by the inventor's wonder, and together they lingered, watching the water drift by in silence. For once, Doof didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. His usual monologues, his stories of misfortune and comically tragic childhood memories, stayed quiet. Here in this dream, there was no need to explain himself, no audience to convince. He could simply be wandering through a world that asked nothing of him except to rest. Above them, the sky shifted into deeper hues. Stars brightened, twinkling in lazy constellations that shaped themselves into odd patterns. For a moment, Doof thought he saw one cluster form the outline of his old ocelot-inator, another that resembled his first science fair volcano. He chuckled. "Even in my dreams, my inventions follow me around." But instead of frustration, the thought only filled him with warmth. Perhaps in this place they weren't failures. Perhaps they were just part of his story, stitched into the sky like memories too fond to let go. The meadow stretched on, the brook winding endlessly. Perry stayed at his side, and Doofenshmirtz's step slowed, his eyelids heavy even in the dream. Here rest seemed to deepen, pulling him further and further into peace. He tilted his head back, gazing at the sky. "For the first time," he whispered, his voice carrying softly across the starlit grass. "I don't feel like I have to chase anything. I can just walk, just exist. And it's enough." The dream heard him, and the stars above pulsed gently in reply. The meadow began to fade, not suddenly, but like a painting gently being washed into another canvas. The shimmering grass dimmed, the starlit brook dissolved into mist, and the silver trees folded inward as though bowing goodbye. Doofenshmirtz did not feel alarmed. Instead, he felt a curious pull, a guiding hand of the dream nudging him toward something more intimate. When the haze cleared, he found himself standing before a small, cozy house. It was not the tall and foreboding building of his childhood in Drusselstein, where shadows crept long across the cracked floors and where bedtime was something cold and lonely. No, this was different. The house was warm, light spilling from its windows in a soft amber glow, and smoke curling gently from a chimney as though announcing that inside was safety. Doof stepped closer, his breath catching. The door opened with a creak, not ominous but welcoming, like the sigh of an old friend. Inside was a room bathed in golden lamplight. A crackling fireplace filled the space with a faint pop and hiss, and the air smelled faintly of cocoa, sweet and rich. There was a bed waiting for him, not a stiff cot, not a forgotten couch, but a real bed, wide, soft, layered with blankets that looked impossibly fluffy, the kind that seemed to embrace you before you even touched them. At the foot of the bed, perched like a guardian plush toy, was Perry the platypus, already settled, his fedora tipped forward just slightly as though he too was ready to rest. Doof's eyes softened. His throat caught with a sound that might have been a laugh, might have been something deeper. This is what it should have been like, huh?" he whispered, almost afraid to disturb the dream. He approached the bed and sat gingerly at the edge. The mattress dipped, welcoming him, holding him in a way no invention ever could. For a long moment he simply sat there, hands resting on his knees, letting the warmth of the room sink into his bones. Then slowly, as if giving in to something he had been denying his whole life, he lay back. The blanket rose up around him, tucking itself as though guided by invisible hands. The fire crackled softly. The golden light dimmed just enough to let the shadows gather in gentle corners. For the first time in decades, Heinz Doofenshmirtz felt like a child who belonged in a bedtime story. Not an afterthought, not a punchline, not the odd boy standing alone in the dark. Here he was simply someone allowed to rest. His eyes fluttered closed, and the dream deepened further. He found himself drifting into a smaller vision within the dream, a lullaby without words. The hum of the Sleep-inator from the real world seemed to filter through, soft and steady, wrapping around him like a melody. It wasn't the sharp, mechanical buzz of his inventions gone wrong. It had transformed into something soothing, like the low strings of a cello played by the night itself. He murmured half-formed words into the blanket, his lips moving as if he were talking to Perry again, or maybe to himself. Finally, warm. Finally, quiet. Perry in the dream gave a small, approving nod before curling up at the foot of the bed, his round form like a watchful anchor. The platypus didn't need to speak. His presence alone was the reassurance Doof had always needed. Outside the window of the dream house, the stars moved slowly across the sky, painting the world in slow arcs of silver light. They didn't hurry, didn't demand attention. They simply drifted, much like the inventor himself. Every heartbeat became slower, every breath deeper. The fireplace murmured softly, and the golden glow dimmed a little more, almost as if tucking the entire world to sleep along with him. Doofenshmirtz, half asleep within a dream, smiled faintly. It wasn't a schemer's grin or the nervous twitch of someone waiting for failure. It was the small, simple smile of a man who, for just one night, was safe. The dream grew quieter still, as though the universe itself was tucking Heinz Doofenshmirtz beneath its starry blanket. The warmth of the fire softened into a golden glow, flickering low but steady, while the air around the bed settled into a hush so profound it felt almost sacred. The entire room had transformed into a cradle of calm, a space built not for scheming or striving, but for rest. Doofenshmirtz sank deeper into the mattress, the blankets drawing around his shoulders as if guided by invisible hands. He let go, truly let go, of the day, of the years, of the endless cycle of plans and failures. The weight he had carried all his life, resentments, insecurities, lonely childhood memories, dissolved into nothingness, leaving only the simple, precious act of breathing. At the foot of the bed, Perry the platypus remained, curled into a perfect, watchful sphere. His presence was not commanding, not intrusive. It was steady, like a lighthouse beam on a calm sea. For Doof, that was enough. He didn't need Perry to speak or act. Just knowing that someone was there, even in a dream, made the silence warm instead of hollow. "Danke," Doof whispered softly into the dim light, his voice so faint it barely seemed to belong to the waking world. The word was not for his inventions, not for his lair, not even for himself. It was for Perry, for the dream, for the quiet gift of peace. The dream responded in kind. Outside the window, the stars shimmered into soft shapes, not cruel parodies of his past, but gentle reminders that even his strangest moments belonged somewhere. A crooked puppet, a birthday balloon, the outline of his tower. They glowed not as failures, but as pieces of a story uniquely his, and at last he could see them without bitterness. The fire dimmed further, settling into embers. Shadows wrapped the room in comfort, folding gently over him like the hand of night itself. Doofenshmirtz exhaled one final long sigh, the kind that comes when every last thread of tension finally unravels. His lips curved into the smallest, most genuine smile, a smile that had nothing to prove. And then, at last, he drifted away. No plotting, no worrying. Only sleep. Heinz Doofenshmirtz, once the lonely boy left standing outside in the cold, now lay safe, warm, and untroubled, dreaming in peace beside the quiet companionship of Perry the platypus. And now we begin the story of Vanessa Doofenshmirtz. If you are still tuned in, comment, "I love the Doofenshmirtz duo," to let us know. The evening air in the city was unusually calm, as though the entire skyline had decided to take a deep collective breath and rest. From the large windows of the Doofenshmirtz apartment, warm golden light spilled gently into the night, soft and inviting against the backdrop of twinkling city towers. Somewhere in the streets below, cars hummed faintly, their engines muted by the distance, blending with the occasional rhythm of footsteps echoing on the sidewalk. For Vanessa, though, all of that felt far away. She had closed the door behind her just a few minutes ago, letting the cool air of the hallway slip away as she entered her own quiet sanctuary. She let out a soft sigh as she set her bag down near the door. Her father was already in his lab corner, or at least what he called a lab corner. To Vanessa, it looked more like a collection of wires, scrap metal, coffee mugs, and the occasional half-finished invention that probably wasn't going to work. He was muttering something under his breath, scribbling notes, tapping buttons, and occasionally dropping a tool that clattered loudly against the floor. Vanessa smiled faintly to herself. She was used to this rhythm. It was background music to her evenings, the hum of her dad's eccentric work. Always dramatic and always a little chaotic, but somehow comforting in its predictability. She didn't need to ask what he was building tonight. She could already guess it was another inventor. Probably something with an overly complicated name that would never quite function the way he intended. She slipped off her jacket and hung it neatly by the door, then wandered into the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. The coolness of the glass against her hands felt grounding after a long day. She leaned against the counter, sipping slowly, letting her shoulders relax for the first time since she'd walked through the door. The apartment itself wasn't fancy. The walls had seen better days, the furniture was mismatched, and half the time the floor seemed to be covered with spare parts from her dad's experiments. But there was something about it that always felt warm to her. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and on nights like this, when she could just breathe and exist without worry, it felt almost like the world outside didn't matter. She set her glass down and padded softly across the living room, her socks brushing against the cool floorboards. The glow of a small table lamp illuminated the corner where she usually curled up with a book or just sat in silence. Tonight the lamp was already on, casting golden shadows that danced gently across the walls. Vanessa moved toward it, pulling her hair into a loose ponytail, her eyes feeling heavier with every passing second. Her father glanced up briefly from his work, a screwdriver still in hand. "Oh, hey, Vanessa," he said absent-mindedly, as if just realizing she had entered. "Don't mind me. I'm on the brink of scientific history here. This is going to be my greatest invention yet." He tapped at something that made a small buzzing sound before quickly fizzling into silence. Vanessa chuckled under her breath. "Sure, Dad. Just don't blow up the kitchen again." He waved a dismissive hand, already absorbed back into his tinkering. "Oh, that was one time. Maybe two. But this time, it's foolproof. Absolutely foolproof." The gentle familiarity of their exchange made Vanessa feel a little lighter. She knew better than to argue he'd spend the whole night convincing himself that whatever he was building was the key to his long list of grand plans. But for her, his enthusiasm was background like the ticking of a clock or the quiet hum of a fan, something to smile at but not to dwell on. Vanessa picked up a blanket from the back of the couch and wrapped it loosely around her shoulders. She walked toward the large window overlooking the city, pressing a hand against the cool glass. The night sky stretched endlessly above, scattered with stars that flickered faintly, half hidden by the haze of the city lights. Even so, the moon shone brightly, casting its silver glow over the rooftops. It was quiet, comfortably, beautifully quiet. And in that quiet, Vanessa began to feel her thoughts slowing down, the rest of her evening stretching out ahead of her like a soft, safe place to rest. Vanessa turned from the window, letting the silver-blue glow of the moon fade into the background as she drifted back toward the center of the room. Her father's muttering continued, a steady stream of half-formed sentences and triumphant declarations that ended in frustrated sighs. The clinking of metal and the occasional zap of electricity punctuated the otherwise calm atmosphere. But Vanessa didn't mind. If anything, it reminded her that she wasn't alone, that somewhere in the apartment, life was carrying on in its own quirky way. She loosened the blanket from her shoulders and folded it neatly across the couch, a small habit she'd picked up from her mother, who had always been particular about order. Vanessa had inherited some of that, even if she was far from perfect at it. In a place like this, tidiness felt like a small act of balance against her father's whirlwind of creative chaos. Her eyes flicked to the small bookshelf tucked between the couch and the window. It wasn't large, just a narrow wooden piece that leaned ever so slightly to the left, but it held enough to keep her company on nights like these. Spines of novels, journals, and a few well-worn magazines peeked out, each one carrying some memory of when she had first read it. She knelt down, tracing her fingers along the row of books, and paused on one she hadn't picked up in years, a slim volume with a dark blue cover, the pages slightly curled from age. She pulled it free and sank down onto the couch, curling her legs beneath her as she opened the first page. The words greeted her like an old friend. She didn't even need to read them quickly. Tonight wasn't about racing through a story. It was about letting the rhythm of sentences and paragraphs flow like gentle waves. Each line was a quiet lull, pulling her deeper into calm. Her father's voice rose again from across the room. "Vanessa, look at this. If this capacitor connects here, then the trajectory should... Oh, wait. Nope, that's not right. Never mind." Vanessa tilted her head with a small smile, not looking up from the page. "I'm sure it'll be amazing, Dad." He paused for a moment, glancing in her direction with a faint look of surprise, as though he'd forgotten she was listening. Then, with renewed energy, he went back to tinkering, muttering phrases that Vanessa couldn't quite make out. The sound blended with the soft rustle of pages turning. Together they filled the room with a kind of harmony, one voice of invention and one voice of quiet reflection. After a while, Vanessa closed the book, resting it against her chest. Her eyelids felt heavier, and she stretched slowly, arching her back and letting out a gentle yawn. She glanced at the clock on the wall, its hands ticking steadily past 9. The night was settling in deeper now. The noises from the city outside had grown even softer, replaced by the distant hum of traffic lights and the occasional bark of a dog somewhere far away. She rose from the couch, carrying the book with her as she made her way to her bedroom door. Her father didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. His focus remained locked on the glowing contraption in front of him, sparks of inspiration lighting up his face, even if the device itself flickered uncertainly. Vanessa lingered in the doorway for a moment, watching him. There was something oddly reassuring about it all, the persistence, the determination, the endless attempts to make something new. For all his quirks, her father's passion filled the apartment with a kind of strange warmth. She felt it even now as she turned the handle and slipped quietly into her own room. Her bedroom was dimly lit by the soft golden glow of a bedside lamp. The bed was neatly made, her pillows stacked with care, and a second blanket folded across the end. On her dresser, a small jewelry box sat next to a photo frame, the picture inside showing her younger self standing awkwardly next to her father in one of his many eccentric suits. She smiled faintly at it, shaking her head before setting the book down on the nightstand. She walked over to the window in her room and pulled the curtains halfway closed, allowing just enough of the moonlight to spill across the floor. The soft glow painted silver lines across the rug, a reminder that the world outside was still alive, even if her little corner of it was winding down. Vanessa slipped out of her shoes, neatly placing them by the dresser, and changed into her pajamas, a comfortable set of deep purple cotton that had become her favorite over the years. As she pulled the sleeves over her arms, she felt her body relax even more, as if the fabric itself signaled that the day was done. She sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers absently along the blanket. The apartment was quieter here, her father's noises muffled by the walls, leaving only the steady hum of the city outside and the soft tick of the clock on her nightstand. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full of small comforts, memories, and the unspoken promise of rest. Vanessa lay back against her pillows, pulling the covers over her legs, and let out another sigh. Her thoughts were beginning to drift. She knew she wasn't ready to sleep just yet, but that didn't matter. For now, she could simply lie there, listening, breathing, and letting the gentle calm of the evening settle around her like a second blanket. Vanessa lay still for a while, gazing at the ceiling as the golden glow of her lamp flickered softly across the room. The shadows it cast stretched and shifted as though they were alive, gently swaying with the rhythm of her thoughts. She pulled the blanket up to her chest and tucked her chin slightly beneath its edge, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh linen. The day had been long, full of errands and conversations, little responsibilities that seemed endless at times. Yet now, in the stillness of her room, those thoughts no longer pressed heavily on her mind. They lingered only faintly, like distant echoes fading into the night. Vanessa always found this transition comforting, that delicate shift between the pace of the day and the quiet surrender of evening. She turned on her side, propping her head up slightly with one hand, and let her eyes wander across her room. Each object held a memory. The photo on her dresser reminded her of birthday parties with her dad, awkward but heartfelt. A small stuffed animal tucked into the corner of her shelf carried echoes of childhood nights when she had clutched it tightly to feel safe. Even the jewelry box, though rarely open now, was full of tiny mementos from different moments in her life. They were all pieces of her story, gathered like threads weaving into a tapestry. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. It was strange how comforting those little pieces could be, especially on nights when she felt the quiet so deeply. They were like lanterns glowing softly in the back of her mind, guiding her through the stillness. She reached over to her nightstand and gently switched the lamp to its lowest setting. The room dimmed into a soft amber glow, enough to see, but not enough to disturb the peacefulness. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the floor like soft brushstrokes of the night. Outside her window, the city was hushed. Lights blinked steadily from distant buildings, and the faint hum of traffic was more like a whisper than a roar. Every so often, she could hear the flutter of wings from a bird settling on a nearby rooftop, or the rustle of leaves carried by the wind. Those sounds blended into a kind of nighttime symphony, one that was both subtle and soothing. Vanessa let her eyes close for a moment, focusing only on her breathing. In and out, slow and steady, the air was cool, carrying a faint trace of the autumn evening, and she let it fill her lungs before releasing it again with a gentle sigh. Her mind, though restless at times, began to quiet itself, lulled by the rhythm of her own breath. A faint sound drifted through the walls, her father humming to himself. She could almost picture him in the living room, crouched over some contraption, completely absorbed in his own world. She imagined him fiddling with buttons, tilting his head in confusion, then cheering quietly when something worked even for a moment. That image brought a soft warmth to her chest. For all of his eccentricities, for all of the times he embarrassed her with over-the-top ideas, there was a kind of comfort in knowing he was there. His presence was steady in its own way, even if his inventions never were. Vanessa rolled onto her back once more, pulling the blanket up to her chin. The soft fabric brushed against her cheeks, and she nestled into the pillow. She thought of the conversation she'd had with her mom earlier in the week, casual and lighthearted. She thought of the friends she hadn't seen in a while, wondering what they were doing at this hour. These thoughts floated through her like drifting clouds, never lingering too long, never pressing too heavily. In the quiet, her body grew heavier with relaxation. She felt the day slipping away completely now, leaving only the comfort of the present moment. Her eyelids fluttered, and though she wasn't ready to fall asleep, she felt herself drifting close to that border between wakefulness and dreams. Vanessa reached once more for her book on the nightstand, flipping it open to where she had left off earlier. The words blurred slightly at first, her tired eyes adjusting to the print. But soon the sentences pulled her in again. Each line was slow and deliberate, carrying her further away from the day. She read without hurry, letting the story's calmness mirror her own. As the minutes passed, she placed the book back down and folded her arms beneath the blanket. Her room felt wrapped in stillness, like a cocoon keeping her safe from the bustle of the city just beyond the walls. It was a small world, her own quiet corner, and it was enough. Vanessa's book rested unopened now, her hand still on the cover as her thoughts drifted beyond the words on the page. She wasn't thinking about anything specific, just letting small memories and feelings wash over her like waves on a shoreline. It was the sort of quiet that didn't need to be filled, the sort that carried its own calm presence. The apartment around her seemed to exhale, too, as if settling into its own rhythm of night. Pipes in the walls clicked faintly as they cooled from the day's use, and the refrigerator hummed steadily from the kitchen. Her father's voice was still faintly audible, punctuated by little bursts of sound whenever something sparked on his workbench. None of it was disruptive. It was simply the texture of home, familiar and strangely soothing. Vanessa turned her head on the pillow, gazing at the window where the curtain let in just a sliver of silver moonlight. She could see the faint outline of her bookshelf against the wall, its shadows long and soft. The air felt cool against her face, but the blankets kept her warm, cocooned in their gentle weight. She tugged them higher, nestling deeper into their folds. A faint smile touched her lips as she thought about how different nights at her dad's place felt compared to her mom's. At her mom's, everything was tidy, quiet, and neatly arranged. Here there was always a kind of cluttered warmth, a sense that things weren't perfect, but they were alive. The two worlds contrasted, yet both belonged to her, and she found comfort in knowing she had a place in each. She stretched her legs under the blankets, feeling the cool sheets slowly warm beneath her. The softness of the fabric brushed against her toes, a small but reassuring detail. Her eyelids felt heavy again, not with sleep just yet, but with the kind of weariness that meant she was exactly where she needed to be. In the distance, a siren wailed faintly, its sound weaving through the city before fading again into silence. Vanessa listened to it until it disappeared, replaced once more by the quiet hum of the apartment. She thought about how large the city was, full of people still awake, each in their own little worlds. And yet, here in her room, everything felt small, contained, safe. Her thoughts wandered toward the future, as they sometimes did on nights like this. What would tomorrow hold? Another ordinary day, perhaps. Maybe a call with her mom, or a visit from a friend. Or maybe just another evening like this, calm, simple, wrapped in the little sounds and comforts of home. And that, she realized, was enough. She shifted onto her side again, curling slightly, and let out a soft sigh. Her father's voice carried one last time through the walls. Yes, it works. Oh, wait, no, it doesn't. His words made her laugh quietly to herself, the sound muffled against her pillow. Vanessa closed her eyes, letting her laughter fade into silence. The apartment grew still once more, as if honoring her need for peace. The ticking of the clock on her nightstand guided her breaths, steady and unhurried, in and out, each inhale blending seamlessly into the night. The lamp glowed dimly beside her, painting everything in amber light. Shadows of the curtains swayed gently, moved by a draft from the window. Beyond them, the moon continued its quiet watch over the city, casting silver reflections across the rooftops. Vanessa's final thought before drifting into that calm, waiting space between wakefulness and dreams was simple. This moment is enough. She didn't need answers or excitement or perfection. She just needed the stillness, the warmth, the sense of belonging in the quiet of her father's apartment. With that thought nestled softly in her mind, she let the night carry her further into rest. Vanessa lay still in the comfort of her bed, the lamp beside her casting a dim glow that seemed to soften the very edges of the room. The hum of the city had become a faraway whisper, and her father's tinkering in the other room had quieted, perhaps giving way to his own fatigue or another late-night distraction. In this calm, her mind began to drift not forward into the worries of tomorrow, but backward, toward the quiet corners of memory. Childhood memories had a way of sneaking in during nights like these, when the world was still and the heart was open. They came not in sharp, detailed recollections, but in soft brushstrokes, like colors bleeding across a canvas. Vanessa let them come, unhurried, as though she were paging slowly through an old photo album in her mind. She remembered the first home she could clearly recall, her mother's place. The smell of fresh laundry often hung in the air, mingling with the scent of the tea her mom liked to make in the evenings. She could almost hear the soft clinking of spoons against ceramic mugs, the way the steam curled upward and fogged the edges of the kitchen window. Vanessa, much younger then, would sit at the table, swinging her legs, waiting for bedtime stories or simply enjoying the quiet hum of her mother's presence. Those nights were always wrapped in a kind of gentle certainty. There was routine, a steadiness to the way everything unfolded. Pajamas neatly folded, stories read aloud, the glow of a lamp turned down at just the right moment. It was the kind of structure that made her feel secure even when she didn't fully understand why. Then came the weekends with her dad. They were always different. Nothing was quite predictable in his world, and yet that unpredictability became its own rhythm. She could still see him greeting her at the door with wild gestures and words that tumbled over one another in excitement. Sometimes he had balloons. Sometimes it was a bizarre invention he wanted to show her, and sometimes it was just a big smile and arms open wide. The apartment back then had felt even more chaotic than it did now. Projects scattered across tables, strange machines humming in corners, and the occasional burnt smell wafting from the kitchen when something went wrong. Vanessa, as a little girl, had learned quickly how to step carefully around wires and to hold her breath when her father announced that he had just about perfected something. Yet even in that chaos, she felt a different kind of comfort. It wasn't about neatness or order. It was about warmth, about knowing her dad always wanted her to be part of his strange little world. One memory surfaced more clearly than the others. A night when she couldn't sleep at her dad's place. She had been much younger, tucked into a bed that felt unfamiliar. Shadows had stretched across the ceiling, and the noises of the city had seemed louder than usual. She remembered tossing and turning, her small hands clutching the blanket tightly. Her father had noticed, of course. He came in awkwardly, still wearing his lab coat, holding what looked like a lamp that he had clearly modified in some way. "Don't worry, Vanessa," he had said in his usual dramatic tone. "This is my patented anti-nightmare innator. It guarantees no bad dreams. Absolutely none." The lamp had flickered uncertainly, buzzing faintly, before casting a very uneven light against the wall. It hadn't exactly worked the way he promised, but Vanessa remembered how he sat at the edge of her bed, patting her hand gently. "See? Perfectly safe. You'll sleep just fine," he had whispered before tiptoeing out. And she had. Not because of the invention, but because of his presence, the way he cared enough to notice her fear and try in his own peculiar way to make it better. Now, lying in her room years later, Vanessa smiled faintly at the memory. Childhood had been a mix of contrasts, her mother's steady calm, her father's unpredictable warmth. Both had shaped her, teaching her different ways to feel safe in the world. Her eyelids grew heavy, but the memories continued to drift gently, one after another, weaving themselves into the quiet of the night. The longer Vanessa lay still, the more the memories blossomed, as if her thoughts had opened a hidden drawer of her past. She let them come, not rushing, just floating gently through them like walking slowly down a familiar street. She remembered afternoons at the park, small hands clutching the swing chains as her father gave her a push. He had never been the kind of parent to stand silently and watch. No, he was the one to narrate the whole adventure as if she were on some grand expedition. "Higher, Vanessa. You are soaring into the stratosphere. Any minute now you'll spot satellites," he would exclaim, arms flailing in the air with his usual dramatic flair. She would laugh, gripping tightly to the swing, the breeze lifting her hair as the sun glowed warmly overhead. At the time, she had rolled her eyes, embarrassed if anyone else in the park looked over. But even then, even as a child, she knew she loved those moments. The sound of his excitement made her feel special, as though even the ordinary act of swinging became extraordinary when he was around. Other memories drifted in afternoons baking cookies with her mother. Her mom's kitchen was always spotless, the counters gleaming, the utensils lined neatly in drawers. Vanessa had loved perching on a stool, spoon in hand, carefully following instructions. Her mother's voice was calm, guiding her step by step. Vanilla and cinnamon would linger in the air, and when the cookies were ready, the whole house seemed to glow with warmth. It was such a contrast to her father's cooking attempts, which usually involved smoke detectors and frantic waving of towels. Still, she remembered both with fondness. From her mother, she learned patience and precision. From her father, she learned that sometimes chaos could still lead to laughter. Her mind wandered next to birthdays. At her mom's, the parties were small and sweet. A few close friends, a cake decorated with careful frosting, candles lit, while voices sang softly. At her dad's, however, birthdays had a way of becoming events. Once he had tried to build a self-frosting cake-inator that unfortunately covered the entire kitchen in whipped cream. Another year he had arranged for a mechanical parrot to deliver her presents, but it malfunctioned halfway and had to be coaxed into landing. At the time, she had groaned, embarrassed by the disasters. But now, looking back, she felt the corners of her lips curl into a smile. There was sincerity in all of it, the father trying in the only way he knew how, even if it came out messy. One particularly vivid memory surfaced. She was around 6 years old, spending a rainy afternoon at her dad's apartment. The thunder outside had frightened her, the windows rattling with every boom. She had sat curled up on the couch, trying to distract herself with a coloring book. Her father had noticed right away. Without a word, he had dashed off into his lab corner and returned minutes later with what he called his cozy cloud-inator. It was essentially a lamp with cotton glued haphazardly on top, glowing with soft light and making a faint whooshing sound. He had placed it beside her on the couch and announced, "There, see? Now the storm isn't outside. It's right here, and it's friendly." The invention had been ridiculous, of course, but the effect had been immediate. She had stopped trembling, leaning against his side as he draped an arm around her shoulders. Together they had listened to the rain, and for the first time that night, she had thought the storm sounded less frightening, almost beautiful. The memory warmed her chest as she lay in bed. Childhood had been filled with these moments, little snapshots that stitched themselves into who she was now. Her mom had given her calmness, order, and gentle strength. Her dad had given her laughter, resilience, and the ability to find comfort in imperfection. The two worlds were different, but both had been hers, and as she thought about them now, she realized how grateful she was for that balance. Her breathing slowed, steady and deep. The room seemed to glow a little softer as her eyelids drooped, but the memories kept flowing, each one a lullaby, pulling her closer to sleep. As Vanessa nestled deeper under her blanket, another memory surfaced, one that made her chest ache with quiet fondness. It was of Perry, back when she was younger and still growing used to her father's peculiar pet. She remembered the first time she had really paid attention to him. Perry had always been there, waddling around the apartment, silent but steady, his teal fur a splash of calm against the constant chaos of her dad's experiments. One evening, when she had been about 9, she had sat on the floor after a long day, feeling upset about something she couldn't even remember clearly now. Perry had patted over without hesitation, curling up near her knee. He hadn't made a sound, hadn't tried to distract her with silly antics like her dad often did. He had just been there, solid and quiet, a reminder that sometimes presence was enough. From that day on, she had come to appreciate him as more than just a pet. He was a little guardian, a quiet companion who never judged and never intruded. Many nights she would find him at the foot of her bed, his tiny body rising and falling with each soft breath, and she would feel safer because of it. Thinking of Perry now brought warmth to her heart. She could almost picture him wandering the apartment, at this very hour, checking corners as if keeping watch, before finding a comfortable place to settle down. Other memories of small adventures came tumbling in after that. Summer afternoons when her dad had insisted on taking her to the boardwalk, declaring that he would win the biggest prize from the game stalls, only to return with a tiny keychain after hours of trying. Vanessa had rolled her eyes, but she had secretly kept the keychain for years, attaching it to her backpack as a reminder of the day. She remembered evenings when she would visit her mom and help tend the garden. Together they had planted flowers along the fence, carefully patting the soil into place and watering them just enough. Vanessa had learned patience in those moments, the art of waiting for something small to grow, trusting it would bloom in its own time. And there were quiet afternoons when she sat in her room with music playing softly, sketching pictures in a notebook. Sometimes they were doodles, sometimes more serious drawing, but always they carried her thoughts, her feelings. Looking back, she realized those sketches had been her way of finding calm away to process the mixture of order and chaos that made up her life. Her childhood had been full of contrasts, but it had also been full of love. She saw it now more clearly than she had at the time. Back then, she had sometimes wished things were simpler, less messy. She had wanted one world, one way of living. But as she grew older, she saw the beauty in having both her mom's steadiness, her dad's spontaneity, and the quiet loyalty of a teal platypus who asked for nothing but gave so much. The memories played like a film reel behind her eyelids. She could see the swing sets, the rainy days, the cookies baking in her mom's oven, the clutter of inventions in her dad's living room, and Perry's quiet gaze always watching over it all. Vanessa's body sank deeper into the mattress as the weight of those memories settled into her like a blanket of their own. They didn't stir longing or regret, only peace, a gentle acknowledgement that her past had shaped her with kindness, even if it hadn't always felt perfect at the time. Her breathing grew slower. The city outside seemed to dim even further, as though honoring her journey inward. She thought of how childhood felt distant now, yet still alive in her heart. It wasn't gone. It had simply become a part of her, waiting quietly in moments like this to remind her of where she had come from. And with that reminder came comfort. Vanessa shifted slightly under her blankets, her body sinking deeper into their warmth as her mind lingered in the haze of memory. The flow of recollections was like a dream within waking. Not sharp or rigid, but soft, blurred at the edges, a watercolor of her past spreading across her present. She thought of times when she was younger, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her toys arranged neatly in a circle. Her dad would sometimes plop down beside her, far too big for the tiny play space, and enthusiastically ask what he could build for her toys to make their lives easier. It usually ended with blocks stacked precariously into some elaborate tower or a miniature cardboard contraption that collapsed within minutes. She had rolled her eyes even then, but she remembered the way his laughter filled the room and how it always drew out her own. The sound another memory shimmered faintly, her mother reading to her before bed. The sound of her voice had been calm, steady, like waves lapping against the shore. Vanessa had loved the way the words carried her into other worlds, the way her eyelids grew heavy as her mom's voice softened toward the end of a story. Those evenings had taught her that peace could be found in stillness, that sometimes the quietest gestures held the most weight. She smiled faintly in the dim glow of her lamp, realizing how much of herself had come from those two halves. Her father's energy had given her the ability to laugh at imperfections, to see beauty in chaos. Her mother's steadiness had shown her how to breathe through life's storms, how to find calm even when the world felt noisy. And Perry, in his own quiet way, had been the silent bridge between those two worlds, a companion who reminded her that presence alone could be a comfort. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how those moments had followed her into adulthood. The patience from afternoons baking cookies had carried into the way she approached challenges. The resilience learned from her father's endless failures had taught her not to fear mistakes. Even the quiet nights listening to the rain had shaped her ability to find beauty in what once felt frightening. Her chest rose and fell slowly, her thoughts unraveling into something lighter now, more like a dream than memory. The line between past and present blurred until the child she had once been seemed to curl beside her in the same bed, safe and content under the same blankets. The ticking of her bedside clock guided her into deeper calm. Each second felt like a soft step into sleep, steady and sure. She blinked slowly, her eyelids heavier than before, the golden glow of the lamp blurring into warmth. Vanessa's last thoughts were not of regret or longing, but of gratitude. Gratitude for her mother's care, her father's endless, eccentric love, and the quiet companionship of a teal platypus who never asked for recognition. Her childhood had not been perfect, but it had been hers, and it had been enough. With that realization, her body surrendered fully to rest. The memories folded themselves gently away, like pages closing in a well-loved book. All that remained was the quiet of the apartment, the hum of the night, and the steady comfort of knowing that the past lived safely within her, guiding her into tomorrow. The lamp flickered softly, shadows stretching across the walls, and Vanessa drifted into the calm embrace of sleep, carrying her memories with her into dreams. The night had settled fully by the time Vanessa stirred again. Her eyes fluttered open in the soft amber glow of her lamp. The room hushed except for the faint tick of the clock and the muffled hum of the city below. For a moment she simply lay there, cocooned in her blanket, listening to the quiet. But then a gentle thought nudged her, the call of the balcony. She slipped the covers back with care, not wanting to disturb the fragile stillness, and swung her legs slowly over the side of the bed. Her toes touched the cool floor, grounding her as she reached for her robe draped across the chair. She slipped it on, the fabric falling loosely around her and padded softly across the room. The curtain swayed slightly as she pulled it aside, revealing the tall glass doors that led to the small balcony. Moonlight pooled faintly across the floorboards, inviting her closer. She pressed her palm gently against the glass for a moment, savoring its chill, before sliding the door open with the quietest of creaks. A rush of cool air brushed against her skin, carrying with it the faint sense of the city, a mix of concrete after a long day's warmth, a trace of rain lingering from earlier showers, and the distant sweetness of flowers from a nearby window box. Vanessa stepped outside, the night folding around her like a soft cloak. The balcony wasn't large, just enough for a chair and a small table, both a little weathered by years of use. But it was hers, a small perch from which to gaze at the city stretched endlessly beyond. She leaned against the railing, the cool metal pressing against her arms as her eyes lifted toward the sky. Above her, the moon hung in perfect stillness, round and radiant. It painted silver highlights along the rooftops, turning ordinary chimneys and antennas into quiet silhouettes against the heavens. A scattering of stars peeked between the city lights, faint but determined, like shy whispers refusing to be silenced. Vanessa inhaled deeply, filling her lungs with the crisp night air. The sounds of the city were gentler here, the occasional car rolling down the street below, its headlights gliding silently like fireflies. The faint murmur of voices from a couple walking somewhere in the distance. The rhythmic buzz of a street lamp, its glow pooling across the sidewalk. None of it felt intrusive. It was simply a language of the night, steady and calming. She tilted her head back, letting the moonlight spill across her face. For a moment she closed her eyes and simply stood there, listening. The hum of the world blended with her own steady breathing until the two became one. Her thoughts wandered gently, as they often did on the balcony. She thought of the people still awake in the apartments across the street, a light glowing faintly here, a shadow moving there. Each window held a life, a story unfolding quietly in parallel with hers. It reminded her of how vast the city was, and yet how intimate the night could feel when she stood here, tucked into her little corner of it. The cool breeze stirred her hair, carrying it across her face in delicate strands. She tucked them back behind her ear and rested her chin on her hand, gazing out across the rooftops. The city felt endless but not overwhelming. Tonight it was softened by the glow of the moon, subdued and gentle, as if even its heartbeat had slowed to match hers. Vanessa let her shoulders relax, leaning more comfortably against the railing. The day's weight had melted away hours ago, but now even the faint remnants of thought and memory seemed to drift off into the air around her. The balcony had always been a place for release, a quiet refuge where she could simply exist without the need to be anything at all. She exhaled slowly, her breath a soft mist in the cool air. And as she stood there, wrapped in moonlight and night sounds, she felt that familiar sense of peace settle over her like a blanket. Vanessa's eyes traced the rooftops stretching toward the horizon. Each one looked slightly different, some with slanted shingles, some flat and square, some cluttered with satellite dishes or rusted pipes. Yet under the moonlight, they all seemed to belong to the same quiet painting, softened by silver glow and distance. Below, the streets told a slower story than the day ever allowed. The crowds had long since vanished, leaving behind wide patches of silence broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps. A cat slipped along the curb, its movements sleek and unhurried, pausing once to glance up at her balcony as if acknowledging her presence. Its eyes gleamed faintly before it disappeared into the shadows, vanishing as though it had been conjured by the night itself. Somewhere farther off, a faint melody drifted through the air. A musician, perhaps, strumming a guitar in the quiet of their own balcony, letting the notes float outward into the city. The sound was soft, distant, but it carried with surprising clarity, weaving itself into the natural hum of traffic and wind. Vanessa tilted her head, listening, smiling faintly as the tune melted into the atmosphere. It wasn't a performance, not something meant for applause. It was simply someone else, awake and alive, adding their rhythm to the lullaby of the night. She drew her robe closer around her shoulders, savoring the embrace of the fabric against the cool air. The warmth of her room still clung faintly to her, but out here she welcomed the contrast. It made her feel awake and grounded, as though the night itself was breathing with her. Her gaze shifted upward again, searching the sky. The moon still reigned above, but her eyes caught on a small cluster of stars hiding between the clouds. They were faint, almost shy, but she admired their persistence. In a city flooded with artificial light, stars had to fight to be seen, and yet here they were, twinkling softly, their glow fragile but unyielding. That thought lingered with her. Persistence, quiet strength. The kind that didn't demand attention but endured anyway. She thought of how her own life had been filled with those moments, times when she had kept moving forward even when things felt heavy, even when she wasn't sure where she was headed. Like the stars above, she had kept shining in her own small way, even when the world around her felt too bright, too noisy to notice. The balcony railing was cool beneath her fingertips as she ran them along its surface absent-mindedly. She thought of how many nights she had stood here before, watching the city unfold. Sometimes she had come out seeking answers, hoping the night would somehow whisper them to her. Other times she had come simply to breathe, to let her thoughts stretch out into the open air where they seemed lighter, less sharp. Tonight felt different, though. There was no urgency in her thoughts, no ache or question pressing on her heart. Tonight was gentler. It was as though the memories she had wandered through earlier had prepared her for this moment, softening her edges, reminding her that peace wasn't found in searching, it was found in allowing herself to simply be. The city seemed to agree. Its rhythm was steady, calm, like a slow heartbeat beneath her balcony, the occasional flicker of headlights, the echo of a distant door closing, the rustle of leaves stirred by the wind. It was all part of the same song, not loud, not demanding, just there, a constant, quiet reassurance. Vanessa leaned her cheek against her hand, her eyelids growing heavier as she gazed outward. The skyline blurred slightly, not from distance, but from the way her eyes softened with fatigue. Still, she didn't move. Not yet. The night felt too inviting, too comforting to leave just yet. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds and cool air wrap around her like an invisible blanket. In that stillness, it felt as though the city wasn't outside her, but part of her, its pulse matching her breath, its lullaby guiding her slowly toward rest. Vanessa's gaze shifted from the sky to the glowing windows scattered across the buildings opposite her. Some glowed brightly, golden squares against the dark brick. Others flickered faintly, as if the light within was hesitant to shine too long. Each one caught her attention, little pockets of life quietly unfolding. She imagined the people inside. One window, high up and to the left, showed the faint silhouette of someone moving around a kitchen. Maybe they were making tea, the kind of late-night ritual she herself enjoyed when sleep didn't come easily. She pictured them standing by their counter, steam rising from a mug, the warm scent filling the air as they cradled it in both hands. Another window, lower and across the street, glowed softer pale blue instead of warm yellow. A television flickered inside, its glow bouncing across the walls. She imagined someone curled on their couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching quietly with tired eyes until the weight of sleep pulled them under. Even the smallest lights drew her curiosity. A single lamp near the far end of the block, glowing steadily on a desk. She thought of a student hunched over their books, maybe scribbling notes, maybe pausing every now and then to glance out the window at the same moon she now admired. Did they also pause just to breathe? Did they find the night as comforting as she did? Vanessa smiled faintly. There was something soothing about it, knowing that all around her, in the hush of midnight, countless stories were still unfolding, some joyful, some mundane, some quiet in their loneliness. And yet they were all bound together by the same blanket of night, the same sky watching over them. Her thoughts softened further as she leaned against the railing. She thought of how she herself must appear from the outside. If anyone across the way happened to look up, they'd see her a slim figure draped in a robe, leaning quietly against a balcony. Maybe they'd wonder about her story. Maybe they'd picture her lost in some dramatic thought, when really she was just enjoying the air, the stillness, the peace of being here now. She liked that idea that strangers could glance at each other's glowing windows and imagine lives for one another, not with judgment, not with envy, but with simple curiosity and quiet respect. The night invited those kinds of thoughts, gentle connections between souls who would never meet. Her eyes drifted back to the skyline. Beyond the windows, the taller buildings loomed, their edges outlined faintly in silver. Some office towers still had lights burning on their upper floors, their reflections shimmering faintly on the glass. Even in those spaces where long hours stretched on, there was life, effort, persistence. The city never truly stopped. But it didn't feel restless tonight. It felt steady, like each light was a heartbeat adding to the calm rhythm around her. Vanessa let her eyes close halfway, her breathing slow and even. She thought of her father somewhere inside, probably tinkering with some half-finished invention. She thought of her mother, whose evenings were different, but steady in their own way. She thought of herself, suspended between both worlds, yet finding her own small rituals, like standing here on this balcony, letting the moonlight hold her while the world continued quietly below. The railing was cool against her arm, the air gentle on her face. It was as though the night itself had leaned down to embrace her, reminding her that she was part of something vast but kind. And in that embrace, Vanessa felt her own edges blur her worries, softening, her thoughts melting into general shapes. The windows across the way continued to glow, silent companions in the dark. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel apart from them. She felt connected, quietly, through the shared rhythm of living, breathing, resting beneath the same sky. Vanessa lingered a little longer, her fingers tracing along the cool railing, her gaze wandering once more to the moon that still held its place above the city. It glowed as if it had been waiting only for her, casting its silver touch across rooftops, windows, and quiet streets. She drew in a slow breath, feeling her chest rise and fall in time with the hush of the wind. The air had grown cooler, and though it wasn't uncomfortable, she could sense the way the night wrapped itself around her like a whisper. She thought again of the stars faint, but determined and let herself smile at the small reminder they gave her, that even the quietest presences still mattered. Her thoughts drifted back over the memories she'd carried earlier in the evening. Childhood laughter, the sound of her mother's voice, the strange, chaotic inventions her father had built that somehow filled their home with more warmth than frustration. Each memory felt less like a sharp picture now and more like soft echoes fading into the background of the night, but never gone. They were with her, shaping her even as she leaned here now. A faint sound caught her ear, the creak of a window somewhere below, followed by the muted clink of glass. Someone else was awake, perhaps sipping water, perhaps looking briefly at the same sky before retreating back inside. The realization brought her comfort. She wasn't truly alone out here. The city breathed with her, alive in its small gestures, its tiny reminders of life carrying on in every direction. Her eyes grew heavier as she rested her chin in her hand, the city blurring in her view. The hum of the streets had softened into something more distant, more dreamlike. Even the music she'd heard earlier, faint guitar chords drifting through the air, seemed to dissolve now, leaving only the steady rhythm of silence. She realized it was time. The balcony had given her what she needed: space, perspective, the quiet reassurance of the world continuing gently around her. But the night was tugging her towards something deeper now, the kind of rest that came only when she surrendered fully to it. With a final glance upward, she whispered a quiet goodnight to the stars, to the moon, to the softly glowing windows across the way. It wasn't a dramatic farewell, just a small acknowledgement of the comfort they had shared with her in this moment. She turned back toward the sliding glass door, her bare feet brushing against the cool balcony floor as she stepped inside. The warmth of her apartment greeted her, instantly familiar, steady. She pulled the door shut, muffling the outside world into a soft hum, and let the golden glow of her lamp guide her back toward her bed. The transition from balcony to bedroom felt like stepping between two worlds, one wide and endless, filled with stars and rooftops and strangers' windows, and one small but no less important, where blankets waited and dreams could unfold. She found herself grateful for both. Vanessa slipped back beneath her covers, the fabric welcoming her, as though it had been waiting all along. She adjusted her pillow, settling deeper into its comfort, and let her body sink fully into rest. The chill from the balcony faded, replaced by the gentle warmth of her room. Her eyelids fluttered, the quiet of the city still echoing in her ears, blending seamlessly with the silence of her home. She exhaled slowly, her breath steady, her mind calmer than it had been in days. And as the last of her waking thoughts drifted away, she carried with her the peace of the balcony and the soft glow of windows and the reminder that she was always part of something larger, something kind. The night had held her gently, and now it released her into the soft embrace of sleep. The soft weight of her blankets had almost convinced Vanessa to stay tucked in for the night, but a small thought nudged her awake again. She wasn't quite ready to let the evening go. There was still one ritual left, one that always made her feel at peace before sleep: a cup of tea. She slipped from her bed with quiet steps, the wooden floor cool under her feet, as she padded toward the kitchen. The apartment was hushed except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the building settling into the night. She liked these sounds, subtle reminders that the world went on in its own rhythm, even as people slept. In the kitchen, she flicked on a small lamp, its golden glow spilling gently across the counters. The air felt different here, carrying the faint scent of herbs from the jars lying neatly on a shelf. Vanessa reached for her favorite mug, the one with tiny painted stars circling its rim, and set it beside the kettle. Filling the kettle was part of the comfort. The sound of water rushing and splashing lightly against the metal container was soothing, like a stream running through the quiet forest of her mind. She placed it carefully on the stove and clicked it on, the low hum beginning immediately. While she waited, she leaned against the counter and let her eyes drift to the window above the sink. The glass reflected her face softly, overlaid against the night sky beyond. It reminded her of the balcony, that same silver moon, the same stars still watching. She thought of the glowing windows she'd seen earlier, of the imagined lives inside them. Somewhere out there, maybe someone else was making tea, too. The thought made her smile faintly. The kettle began to murmur, a faint bubbling building slowly toward a boil. Vanessa liked this part best, the anticipation, the promise of warmth in a few moments. She chose a calming blend from the shelf, chamomile with a hint of lavender, and placed the tea bag gently into her mug. The steam soon curled upward as she poured the water, the faint aroma rising instantly into the air. It was like breathing in calm itself. She cradled the mug in her hands, feeling the gentle heat radiating through the ceramic. That warmth seeped into her fingers, soothing and steady. She lifted it carefully, letting the steam brush against her face before taking the first sip. The taste was soft, floral, grounding the kind of flavor that seemed to remind her body that it was safe to let go, safe to rest. The silence of the kitchen deepened, broken only by the occasional tick of the cooling kettle. Vanessa let her shoulders relax, sinking into the chair near the small table. The glow from the lamp cast a circle of light around her, while the rest of the apartment remained shadowed, hushed. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just her, the tea, and the night. And then softly, there was the faintest sound of padded feet. Vanessa glanced toward the doorway, and her expression softened instantly. Perry had wandered in, his teal fur slightly tousled, his small, steady eyes blinking in the light. He didn't make a sound. No secret agent sharpness now, just the quiet presence of a pet checking in. Without hesitation, he padded across the kitchen floor and curled himself at her feet, tucking his bill against his chest. Vanessa reached down, brushing her fingers gently across his back. "Hey, Perry," she whispered, her voice calm, fond. He gave no reply, of course, but she didn't need one. His presence was enough, warm, loyal, grounding her even further in the calm of the night. Together they sat there in the golden circle of light, the steam of the tea rising between them, the silence of the apartment wrapping them in its gentle embrace. The tea's steam drifted upward in slow curls, dissolving into the dim light. Vanessa let her hands rest around the mug, savoring each breath of the floral aroma before taking another sip. Every swallow left behind a warmth that spread gently through her chest, loosening any tension that had clung to her since the day began. At her feet, Perry had already settled into stillness, his teal body curled into a perfect circle of calm. His steady breathing was almost inaudible, but Vanessa could feel it somehow, a soft rhythm echoing her own. She reached her toes slightly toward him under the table, brushing gently against his side, and he didn't stir, only adjusting his position so that more of his weight pressed into the floor beside her chair. It was a small thing, but it made her heart feel lighter. Perry wasn't the type to demand attention. He never filled the silence with noise. Instead, he filled it with presence. And for Vanessa, that had always been enough. She leaned her elbow against the table, resting her cheek in her hand, and let her eyes half close. The kitchen lamp glowed softly above her, leaving the corners of the room in gentle shadow. In that cocoon of golden light, the world felt far away, as though the night outside were simply holding its breath, waiting patiently while she enjoyed this moment. The kettle on the stove clicked faintly as it cooled, each tick sounding like a slow heartbeat. The refrigerator hummed. Perry exhaled. And in between, silence stretched out, not empty, but filled with quiet comfort. She thought briefly of how different nights could feel. Sometimes the dark was restless, filled with thoughts that swirled and refused to quiet down. But then there were nights like this night's where everything settled into its place, where even the stillness carried a soft reassurance. Tonight, she felt grateful for that balance. Vanessa took another sip, her mug now lighter in her hands. She let the tea linger on her tongue, savoring it, before setting the cup gently back on the table. Her fingers traced the rim absently, not wanting the moment to pass too quickly. Perry lifted his head just enough to blink up at her, his eyes catching the glow of the lamp. She smiled faintly and reached down again, brushing her hand over the top of his head. His fur was soft beneath her fingers, and though he made no sound, she thought she saw the tiniest flicker of acknowledgement, as if he understood the gesture and offered his quiet reply. "Thanks for keeping me company," she whispered. The words weren't necessary, but saying them out loud felt right. The night seemed to receive them gently, folding them into its stillness. Vanessa leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a few breaths, simply listening. The warmth of the tea lingered in her chest. The companionship of Perry lingered at her feet. And together they created a quiet, stronger than any wall, a peace deeper than silence alone could offer. At last, she opened her eyes again, noticing the way the light reflected off the surface of her tea. Only a small amount remained, the steam now fainter but the comfort still present. She reached for the mug once more, lifting it with both hands as if it were a final little ceremony before rest. The last sip was warm, soothing, and complete. She let the flavors stay with her a moment longer before placing the empty mug on the counter. The circle of calm she'd built here in the kitchen didn't vanish, it simply followed her, as though it would accompany her wherever she went next. Vanessa rose slowly, stretching her arms above her head, and smiled at the little sound of Perry's claws clicking lightly on the floor as he stood too, ready to follow. She gave the kitchen one last glance, the soft glow of the lamp, the resting kettle, the empty mug, and then she reached over to switch the light off. Darkness folded gently around them both, and the apartment grew even quieter. The click of the lamp left the kitchen in shadow, but the quiet didn't feel empty. Instead, the darkness wrapped itself around Vanessa like a soft blanket, guiding her steps as she made her way back down the hall. Perry's small footsteps padded after her, steady and loyal, always keeping just close enough that she could sense him without needing to look. The apartment at night had its own personality, calmer, slower, with details that often went unnoticed during the day. The hum of the refrigerator was now a faint background memory. The walls seemed to hold on to sound a little longer, making her footsteps feel softer. Even the air itself seemed gentler, as though it had settled into the stillness right alongside her. Vanessa ran her hand along the wall as she walked, grounding herself in the familiar texture. She didn't rush. There was no need. The night wasn't urging her forward, only inviting her to move at her own pace. Each step felt deliberate, each breath unhurried. Perry, padding faithfully at her side, gave the faintest shake of his head, the sound of his small bill brushing against the air. Vanessa glanced down at him, her lips curling into a small smile. "Still awake, huh?" she murmured, though she knew he'd offer no reply. The hallway stretched ahead, dim but not unfriendly. A soft sliver of moonlight slipped in from a window at the far end, touching the wooden floor with pale silver. Vanessa paused for a moment just to look at it. The glow felt like a companion, a gentle reminder that the night outside was vast and endless, even as her own world narrowed into the quiet of her home. When she reached her bedroom doorway, she pushed it open with a slow, careful motion. The room was just as she'd left it, the blanket slightly rumpled, the glow of her bedside lamp still waiting patiently, casting its amber light across the bed. The air held the faintest trace of her earlier presence, a mingling of lavender and warmth. Perry slipped inside ahead of her, circling once before settling down near the foot of the bed. He didn't curl all the way into sleep yet. Instead, he rested his head on his folded paws, watching her with calm eyes as she moved quietly about the room. Vanessa smiled at him again, touched by how natural it felt to have him there. She didn't speak this time. There was no need for words when the silence was already saying everything. She set the empty mug on her nightstand for the morning, then brushed her fingers lightly across the lamp's base. For a moment, she didn't switch it off. Instead, she simply stood there, watching the way its warm glow touched the walls, the way shadows stretched gently across the floor. It felt like standing in a painting made only of light and calm. Finally, she drew back the covers and sat at the edge of her bed. The fabric was cool against her legs at first, then quickly warmed as she slid beneath it. The bed seemed to welcome her back, pulling her into its softness. Perry, sensing her movement, lifted his head. He gave a small shift, repositioning himself a little closer to the foot of the bed, as though making sure he could keep watch more comfortably. "Good night, Perry," Vanessa whispered softly, her voice already heavy with the edges of drowsiness. The platypus gave no reply, only lowered his head back down with a slow, steady motion, his eyes blinking once before closing. Vanessa pulled the blanket up to her chin and let herself sink deeper into the pillows. The tea still warmed her from within, and the presence of her quiet companion filled the room with reassurance. The night outside might stretch endlessly, but here, in this small circle of lamplight and comfort, she felt completely at home. The calm she had carried from the kitchen followed her still, like a soft echo of warmth that reached into every corner of her room. Vanessa lay still for a few moments, letting the gentle rhythm of her breathing match the quiet pulse of the room. The amber glow of the bedside lamp softened the edges of everything, the folds in her blanket, the curve of the nightstand, the soft outline of Perry resting at the foot of the bed. It was as if the light itself had learned to whisper, filling the air with a calm that words could never quite capture. Her thoughts moved lazily now, no longer chasing after worries or lists of things left undone. Instead, they drifted, like leaves caught on a slow current. She thought of the balcony, the breeze, the way the city had twinkled faintly beneath the stars. She thought of the kitchen, the warmth of the tea, and the quiet company that had joined her there. Each memory was like a stepping stone, carrying her gently closer to rest. She turned her head slightly on the pillow, eyes tracing the shape of Perry's small body stretched across the covers at the edge of the bed. His breathing was even, steady, a sound so subtle it blended into the silence. But knowing he was there grounded her in the best way. Vanessa let out a slow sigh, her eyelids growing heavier. Still, she kept them open just long enough to glance at the lamp once more. Its glow was comforting, but she knew the moment had come to let the night fully embrace her. She reached out from beneath the covers, her fingers brushing over the switch. For a heartbeat she hesitated, watching how the warm halo of light filled the room, wrapping her in its gentle gold. With a quiet click, the lamp went dark. The room transformed instantly, but not in a way that felt cold or unfriendly. Instead, the shadows stretched softly, and the faint silver of moonlight slipped in through the window, painting the room in calm blue-gray. It was a different kind of peace, deeper, quieter, closer to the heart of the night. Vanessa shifted onto her side, pulling the blanket up to her cheek. The pillow cradled her head, and her body melted deeper into the mattress. Every muscle seemed to release at once, as though the dark itself had given her permission to let go. Her thoughts grew simpler still. A line of music lingered faintly in her memory. A shape of a star she'd seen earlier flickered behind her closed eyes. She pictured the steam of the tea rising in the kitchen, blending into the still air, just as her awareness now drifted upward and away. Perry stirred once, stretching his little body before resettling closer to her feet. The faint weight of his presence reached her like a second blanket, invisible, but so very real. She smiled softly in the dark, her lips barely curving, the expression already fading as sleep pressed closer. The apartment was utterly still now. The hallway, the kitchen, the balcony, all resting, and just as she was. The city outside had quieted into a distant hum, softened by the hush of the night, and above it all, the stars continued their silent vigil, unseen but steady, their light traveling patiently through the sky. Vanessa's breathing slowed into the rhythm of rest, steady and deep. The last conscious thought she held was not of the past day, nor of the days to come, but simply of this, the warmth of the blanket, the quiet of her home, and the comforting presence of a teal figure who had chosen, without words, to share the silence with her. And with that, the night carried her gently into sleep. Sleep came quietly, like a tide creeping across sand. Vanessa didn't even notice the exact moment when her thoughts stopped belonging to the waking world. They simply began to drift, softening at the edges, melting into images that flickered in her mind like candle flames in the dark. At first, she was aware only of weightlessness. Her body, though still nestled in her bed, seemed to dissolve as though she were no longer bound by the softness of her blankets or the curve of her pillow. She floated, carried on a current of silence deeper than anything she had known in the waking hours. The darkness around her shifted, not into light but into color muted at first, a wash of violet and blue as though the night sky had pulled itself close to her. The stars she had glimpsed earlier seemed brighter now, clearer, spread across a horizon that stretched farther than her eyes could follow, yet it didn't feel distant or overwhelming. Instead, the sky felt close, as if it had drawn down just to cradle her in its vast, starry arms. She felt her feet touch something not ground exactly, but a surface that rippled gently beneath her as though it were made of light itself. She looked down and saw that she was standing on a path woven from stars. Each step she took shimmered faintly, sending ripples outward into the deep velvet blue around her. There was no hurry here. Each step she made was guided not by destination, but by curiosity, by wonder. And though the dream had no map, no directions, she felt perfectly at ease. The path knew where it was going, even if she did not. In the distance, faint shapes began to emerge. A row of lanterns hung in the air as if strung across nothing at all, glowing golden against the indigo. Their light swayed gently, carried by a breeze she could feel on her skin, cool and refreshing. As she approached them, she noticed they weren't ordinary lanterns. Each one contained something inside a memory, captured in soft, moving images. Vanessa stopped before the first. Within its glass, she saw herself as a child, sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor, flipping through an old tattered book of stories. She remembered the way the pages had smelled faintly of dust and something comforting, like safety and time. The image glowed gently, fading as she moved toward the next lantern. In the second, she saw herself on her balcony, much like earlier that very night, leaning against the railing, staring at the stars. But here in the dream, the stars leaned closer back, their light bending downward as if listening to her thoughts. She smiled faintly at the image, her heart filling with the same quiet she had carried with her before sleep. The lanterns stretched on ahead, each one carrying its own reflection, its own gentle reminder of moments she had lived but never fully held on to. The dream didn't feel like it was inventing something new. It felt like it was stitching together pieces of her life she had almost forgotten, weaving them into a tapestry of light. And all the while, the path of stars continued beneath her, patient and endless, waiting to guide her wherever the dream wished to take her. Vanessa lifted her gaze once more to the vastness above. The sky glowed not with a single moon, but many, scattered like pearls across the horizon, each one radiating a soft silver warmth. They felt less like celestial bodies and more like guardians, watching her quietly as she drifted further into the dream. She walked on, and the lanterns swayed gently in her wake. The lanterns grew fewer as Vanessa walked farther along the starlit path, their golden glow fading into the distance behind her. The dream seemed to sense it was time for a shift. The air changed, warmer now, filled with a hush like the faint sound of pages turning. When she looked ahead, the rippling star path curved, and beyond it she saw a shape emerging a house. Not just any house, but one she recognized at once, her childhood home. Yet it wasn't quite the same. Dreams had softened its edges, stretched its colors, and wrapped it in a glow that was both strange and comforting. The walls glistened faintly, as though painted with moonlight. The windows shimmered, showing hints of moving images inside, memories flickering like films across their glass. Even the front door looked different. Taller, arched, crowned with a frame of silver ivy that sparkled under the dream's endless sky. Vanessa hesitated for a moment, not from fear, but from awe. She had not thought of this place in so long. Memories tugged at her as she stepped forward moments of sitting on the living room carpet, the faint scent of her father's coffee, the sound of distant music drifting from a radio. She touched the doorknob, which glowed faintly beneath her hand, and with a gentle push, the door opened without resistance. Inside, the house was both familiar and not. The furniture seemed larger, dream-sized, the ceiling stretching high as if it had no end. Light filled the rooms, not from lamps, but from floating orbs drifting like bubbles in the air, glowing with soft amber and blue. When she reached out to touch one, it burst soundlessly. Releasing the scent of something, she remembered the warm fragrance of vanilla cookies she had once helped bake long ago. Room by room she wandered, and each space unfolded differently. The living room was scattered with fragments of her past. Her favorite blanket draped over the couch, a forgotten sketchbook lying open on the floor, a half-finished drawing still marked in pencil. The fireplace flickered with no fire, but with glowing shapes, tiny sparks of light that danced upward like fireflies, vanishing into the air. The kitchen appeared next, but here it was more dream than memory. The counters gleamed, and the stove hummed gently, though nothing cooked upon it. On the table stood a teacup, her teacup from earlier in the night, still steaming as though she had only just left it there. She lifted it to her lips, and though she felt nothing physical, the taste lingered anyway. Chamomile, soft and floral, the comfort of bedtime returning even here in this dream. As she moved deeper, Vanessa noticed that not all the rooms were hers alone. Some were filled with shadows, not dark or frightening, but suggestive outlines of people she once knew, friends, schoolmates. Faint voices drifted, muffled but warm, like laughter heard through a closed door. She didn't open those doors, not yet. She only stood quietly, listening, her heart filling with a strange mixture of nostalgia and calm. At last she climbed the staircase. It was longer than it had ever been, stretching upward as though into the stars themselves. Yet her steps felt light, effortless. At the top she found her childhood bedroom. It too was transformed. The bed was still there, covered in familiar patterned sheets, but it seemed wider, more inviting, its blanket glowing faintly with a silver sheen. Posters she half remembered lined the walls, though they shimmered, changing images when she looked at them, shifting from cartoons she had loved to constellations she had studied, to abstract swirls of light. The room itself pulsed with a gentle rhythm, almost as though it were breathing. She crossed to the window, which opened not onto a street or backyard, but onto the night sky itself. Stars stretched endlessly beyond the glass, so close she could almost reach out and touch them. Vanessa pressed her hand to the window pane. It was cool beneath her palm, grounding her, reminding her that even here in a dream, in a place shaped by memory and imagination, she was safe. Behind her, she heard a small sound almost like a rustle. She turned, half expecting to see Perry curled somewhere nearby, though she knew he had not followed her into the dream. Instead, there was only her bed, glowing softly, as if inviting her to rest within her own dream. And slowly, Vanessa stepped closer. The glow from the dream bedroom wrapped around Vanessa like a quiet embrace. For a long moment, she simply stood there, gazing at the bed that felt both hers and not hers, familiar yet radiant, with an otherworldly shimmer. It seemed to wait patiently, as though it had always known she would return to it, even if only here, in this soft corner of sleep. She lowered herself onto the bed. The blanket was cool against her fingertips at first, then warmed quickly, like it was adjusting to her presence. When she lay back, she didn't sink into the mattress so much as drift upon it, as though the bed were made of clouds instead of fabric. Her body grew lighter, her breath steady, the edges of her thoughts loosening once again. The window before her shimmered, the stars beyond shifting, not fixed, but moving slowly in spirals, as though they too had fallen to their own kind of dance. The faint rhythm of their movement lulled her further, until her eyelids closed once more. And then, without realizing, Vanessa slipped deeper still into a dream within her dream. When she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in her childhood room. Instead, she stood in the middle of a vast garden. It wasn't a garden she had ever visited, yet it felt familiar in a way dreams often made things feel. The ground was carpeted in soft moss that glowed faintly under her feet, like stepping stones of light. Flowers rose around her, enormous and luminous, their petals shifting colors as if painted by moonbeams. Some leaned toward her as she walked past, brushing her arms with feather-light caresses. The air was filled with a low hum, not music exactly, but something close, a vibration that resonated gently in her chest, calming her with each step she took. Fireflies glowed brighter here, their light not yellow but pale blue and lavender, swirling lazily in patterns that resembled constellations. At the center of the garden stood a fountain, though no water flowed from it. Instead, streams of light poured upward, rising like ribbons into the air before dissolving into mist. The sound it made was softer than water, like the sigh of the night itself. Vanessa approached, her hand reaching out toward one of the glowing streams. When her fingertips touched it, the light curled around her hand, spiraling gently before drifting upward, carrying with it a fragment of something. It was a memory, faint, fleeting, but hers. The laughter of her father as he once tried, unsuccessfully, to fix a broken toaster. The silly way he had insisted it was just a minor adjustment before sparks had flown. She smiled softly, the memory glowing in her chest like a lantern. Then the ribbon of light carried it away, releasing it into the garden air. One by one, more memories revealed themselves as she touched the fountain. One of them was her learning to ride a bicycle, wobbly at first, before finally balancing on her own. Another was a rainy afternoon spent indoors, listening to the patter against the windows. And one was the quiet companionship of reading a book while the world outside seemed to blur away. Each memory was gentle, never overwhelming. The dream didn't force her to relive them, only to notice them, to see them for the soft, precious moments they were. As she lingered, Vanessa realized the garden itself seemed to respond to her. With each step, new flowers bloomed, glowing brighter in the direction she moved. It was as though the dream encouraged her forward, guiding her deeper into its heart. Soon she came upon a stone archway at the far edge of the garden. It was draped in vines that sparkled faintly like starlight caught in dew. Beyond the arch, she could see only mist, pale and inviting. A path stretched onward, but its destination was hidden. She hesitated, her hand resting lightly against the cool stone. Part of her wondered what lay beyond. Another part knew that in dreams, questions often mattered more than answers. Still, curiosity tugged at her, gentle but persistent. And so, with a breath as calm as the night itself, Vanessa stepped forward, crossing the threshold into the mist. The garden fell away, and the dream shifted once again. The mist embraced Vanessa as she passed through the archway. It wasn't cold or damp, but feather-soft, like walking through the folds of a dream's veil. For a moment she could see nothing at all, only the silvery glow that surrounded her. Then, slowly, the fog began to lift, unveiling a new place, waiting in silence. Before her stretched a vast lake, smooth as glass. It reflected the starry heavens above so perfectly that it was difficult to tell where the sky ended and the water began. Stars twinkled below her feet, as though she could walk across them, and the moon hung doubly bright, once in the sky, once mirrored in the lake's surface. The air here was still hushed, yet not empty. It was full of a presence she couldn't quite name, something vast, serene, watching over her with patience. The ripples of her breath alone stirred the reflection, small circles of silver spreading outward like gentle whispers. Drawn by the beauty, Vanessa stepped closer to the edge. To her surprise, the water didn't lap at the shore as ordinary lakes did. Instead, it held steady as though waiting for her. Kneeling down, she dipped her fingers into the surface. The water wasn't wet. Not really. It felt like cool light, liquid starlight running between her fingers. Where she touched, the surface glowed brighter, forming soft rings of radiance that pulsed outward, spreading across the mirrored lake. And then, as if responding to her touch, visions began to appear upon the surface. First, a younger version of herself shimmered there, sitting on the edge of her bed, sketchbook in hand, lost in thought. The image dissolved and shifted into another, her teenage self standing beside her father, arms crossed, a fond smirk tugging at her lips as he explained some outlandish invention. Another shift, and she saw herself walking quietly down a street at night, the lamps glowing around her, her expression contemplative but calm. The visions weren't grand events. They were ordinary, everyday pieces of her life, but here they gleamed like constellations, each one precious, each one part of her. The lake was showing her what she sometimes overlooked, the quiet strength woven to her own story. A warmth filled her chest, not unlike the chamomile tea she had sipped earlier. It spread slowly, gently, until it touched every part of her, easing whatever restlessness lingered. The dream seemed to sense this change, and the lake responded. From its center, ripples spread, though nothing had disturbed it. The reflection of the stars brightened, until it looked as though the whole sky had gathered there, resting in the water's embrace. Then, as though carried by the ripples themselves, a path of glowing stones rose from the lake, one by one, leading toward the center. Each stone shone with a soft silvery blue glow, inviting her to step upon them. Without fear, Vanessa followed. Each step was soundless, each stone steady beneath her feet, though they floated upon the starry water. As she reached the middle of the lake, the air shifted again, soft currents of wind moving as though unseen wings brushed past. At the center, no grand monument waited. Only a single tree stood tall, slender, glowing faintly as though woven from moonlight. Its branches spread wide, and from them hung countless tiny lanterns of light, swaying gently, though no breeze stirred. They looked like captured fireflies, or perhaps memories, glowing softly against the endless nights. Vanessa reached out, brushing her fingertips against the bark. It was smooth, cool, and thrummed faintly, with a rhythm like a heartbeat. She closed her eyes, and for a moment, everything stilled. The stars, the lake, the air itself, all of it seemed to pause in harmony. In that quiet, she felt whole at rest, as though the dream had led her here for this one simple purpose, to remind her that peace was always waiting, somewhere within her, even when the waking world felt tangled or uncertain. She stayed there, standing beneath the glowing tree at the center of the mirrored lake, until the dream began to soften again, the stars dimming slightly at the edges, the lanterns swaying slower. And in that fading glow, Vanessa felt herself drifting not out of the dream entirely, but deeper still, toward the final quiet moments of night. The soft glow of the dream's lantern tree lingered in Vanessa's memory, even as the vision began to dissolve into something quieter, simpler. She felt the dream retreat around her, not suddenly, but gradually, like a tide easing back from the shore. The shimmering water, the glowing garden, the misty archways, all of it grew more transparent with every breath she took, fading into the background of her mind, until only the sense of calm remained. She did not resist. Instead, she let the dream carry her where it wished, like a leaf upon a still current. Slowly, the world around her became darker, yet not in a frightening way. It was a darkness filled with safety, a velvet kind of night where nothing stirred, where no sharp edges waited. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her own room. The walls were no longer glowing with dreamlight, but painted with the softer, more familiar shadows of her reality. The lamp on her nightstand cast a faint amber halo, steady and reassuring. Her blankets, once shimmering clouds in her dream, were now warm fabric tucked neatly around her. She lay on her side, half curled beneath them, the weight of the covers like a gentle embrace. The chamomile tea she had left on the nightstand had cooled, though its faint aroma still drifted faintly in the air. Vanessa inhaled deeply, and the scent alone was enough to remind her of the warmth she had felt while drinking it. It was as though the tea had woven itself into her, carrying its calm into her bones. On the floor near her bed, Perry stirred softly. The teal platypus had followed her here, not in his secret agent form, but as her quiet, faithful companion. His breathing was even, little more than a faint whisper in the silence, and the sight of him, curled up by her side, gave her a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. She smiled faintly, too tired to laugh or even whisper a word, but her chest eased knowing he was there. Outside her window, the world was utterly still. The city seemed to have fallen into the same slumber she had entered. No sounds of cars, no distant hum of activity, only the occasional brush of wind against the glass. The stars that had danced so vividly in her dream now twinkled faintly, ordinary but beautiful, scattered across the midnight sky. Vanessa's eyes fluttered shut again, and though she knew she was back in her bed, it didn't feel so different from the dream. The two realms had blurred together, the luminous world of her imagination and the quiet peace of her reality. She carried the glow of one into the stillness of the other, and together they wove a blanket of serenity that made her body grow heavier with each breath. Her thoughts, which so often swirled with questions and sharp edges, had softened. She wasn't worried about tomorrow or the day after. She wasn't replaying old conversations or searching for answers. Tonight, all of that seemed far away, drifting beyond reach. What remained was only this: the warmth of her bed, the faint scent of tea, the quiet presence of Perry, and the hush of the night wrapping around her like a lullaby. Vanessa breathed deeply, her chest rising and falling, in a rhythm as steady as the stars. Her body grew heavier still, her mind lighter. She didn't need to hold on to anything anymore. She could simply rest and let the night hold her. And so, without effort, she let herself slip deeper into peaceful slumber. The first stages of sleep wrapped around Vanessa like a slow-moving tide, pulling her deeper with every breath she released. Her body had already given itself to stillness, sinking into the mattress as though the bed itself had grown softer, more cloud-like. With every passing second, her shoulders, once carrying the faintest trace of tension, were loose now. Her arms, draped over the blanket, rested without effort. Even her fingers seemed lighter, almost floating in their own ease. Her mind, too, softened. The crisp edges of thought faded until they became impressions, half-formed images that didn't need to connect to anything solid. A half-memory of her childhood bedroom, a fleeting thought of the night sky, the echo of her father's voice, muffled but fond. Each one rose and fell like waves, brief and tender, never clinging. In the midst of this half-dream, Vanessa felt herself wandering again, though not in the vivid dreamscapes of glowing trees and mirrored lakes. This was subtler, quieter. She found herself walking through corridors of memory, simple ones, unadorned yet comforting in their familiarity. She saw herself as a younger girl sitting on a window ledge with a book in her lap, the streetlights outside casting their orange glow. She saw herself lying in the grass of a quiet park, the sky above her endless and blue. She saw herself sitting across from her father at the kitchen table, a warm drink between them, and despite his eccentric ramblings, she remembered feeling understood, even if only in small ways. Each image passed gently, like lanterns floating on water. None lingered too long, none asked for anything of her. They simply drifted by, letting her acknowledge them, then fade again into the hush of her subconscious. And deeper she sank. Her breathing slowed, so steady it almost matched the rhythm of the night outside her window. Perry shifted faintly on the floor, a tiny sigh escaping him, as if in his own sleep he mirrored her ease. Vanessa smiled faintly in her dreams, though she didn't know she did. The boundaries of her body began to blur. She could no longer tell where she ended and where the warmth of her bed began. The blanket, the pillow, the mattress, all of it felt like one continuous embrace, holding her steady as she slipped further inward. If her earlier dreams had been journeys, places to wander, sights to behold, this was different. This was the kind of dream that wasn't about seeing or doing, but about being. A dream where the only landscape was calm itself, where the only sound was the slow, steady cadence of her own breath. It was here, in this quiet depth, that she felt most at home. No need to perform, no need to guard herself, no need to be clever or cautious, only rest. Only the assurance that the night would hold her gently until morning came. Her heart slowed to match that rhythm. Her mind, once a restless tangle, was smooth and still, like the glassy surface of the dream lake she had left behind. And if thoughts did appear, they were like distant stars, faint, far off, twinkling quietly without ever demanding her attention. The deeper Vanessa drifted, the more she realized that slumber wasn't simply an absence of waking life. It was its own kind of presence, its own sanctuary, a space where her spirit could breathe without weight. She surrendered completely now. There was no resistance, no hesitation. Only the gentle, inevitable pull of rest, carrying her further into the embrace of night. Time no longer seemed to exist for Vanessa. She had passed beyond the point of noticing how long she had been asleep. The world of clocks and schedules and tomorrow's responsibilities had dissolved, leaving only the timeless rhythm of her breathing and the vast, endless sea of her rest. In this depth of slumber, her dreams no longer took the shape of clear stories or places. Instead, they were like brushstrokes on an endless canvas, colors, sensations, whispers of feelings. She floated within them as though she herself were part of the painting, drifting peacefully from one gentle image to the next. At first, she saw soft washes of color, shifting slowly like the aurora across a midnight sky. Deep indigos, silvery blues, muted golds, each one fading seamlessly into the next, flowing with the grace of water. The colors didn't surround her so much as they held her, wrapping her in warmth and coolness, balance and calm. Then the colors gave way to textures. The sensation of grass beneath her hands, though she wasn't really lying in a meadow. The warmth of sunlight brushing her face, though no sun shone here. The hush of water moving gently against her feet, though no shore could be seen. Each feeling was a fragment, a dream's way of reminding her body how it felt to be safe, how it felt to be at ease. Occasionally, faint sounds drifted through the quiet, a lull of wind chimes, so delicate they almost seemed imagined. The low murmur of a stream, steady and unhurried. Once even the softest melody of a voice humming a lullaby familiar, though Vanessa could not say from where. These sounds were not there to awaken her. They were like the night itself, breathing, giving shape to her stillness. Her body sank deeper, so deeply now that she was no longer aware of it at all. The weight of her limbs, the outline of her frame, even the gentle rise and fall of her chest, all had blurred into the sensation of floating, as though she were carried by an invisible current. It was not emptiness. It was fullness of a different kind, a fullness made of peace. There were no questions here, no shadows of worry, no need for her to figure anything out. Here, in the quietest depths of her slumber, she was whole, even if she didn't think of it that way. The dream shifted once more, softer still. Now she imagined herself wrapped in a cocoon of light, a veil of silver threads that shimmered faintly into the dark. They cradled her like a hammock in the air, swaying gently back and forth, the motion slow enough to blur into timelessness. And Perry, even though he was asleep on the floor of her room, appeared here too in the quietest way. Not in form, not in voice, but in presence. A sense of companionship, of loyalty, of something small and steady watching over her, even as she drifted beyond awareness. She felt safe, as though nothing in the world could disturb this cocoon of light and quiet. The deeper she sank, the more she realized that there was nothing left to do. No dream to follow, no thought to answer, no image to cling to. Just the soft, boundless stillness of pure slumber, not empty, not silent, but deeply alive with peace. She floated there endlessly, without beginning or end, without effort or expectation. A quiet star adrift in an infinite sky at home in her own stillness. Vanessa drifted in the depths of her dreams, and the night carried her like a river. She had surrendered so fully to rest that even the smallest trace of thought had dissolved. There was no longer a difference between her body and the bed, between her breath and the quiet air around her. She was part of the stillness now, folded into it as though she had always belonged there. The dreamscape shifted once more, though softly, gently. She found herself beneath a wide, starlit sky. The stars glowed in endless constellations, each one pulsing faintly as though it breathed with her. She walked slowly, and though her feet touched no ground, it felt like drifting rather than moving, the universe itself carrying her wherever she needed to go. Here in this space there was no weight of past or future, only presence, only the gentle rhythm of existence itself. She could feel the night not as something outside her window, but as something within her, a calm, a shelter, a boundless expanse where she could rest forever. Perry appeared again in this dream, though he did not speak or move. He was simply there, sitting quietly beside her, his small teal form steady and familiar. His presence was enough. It reminded Vanessa that she was not alone, that rest was not only for herself, but for those who cared in their own quiet ways. The stars above began to soften, their glow dimming, not with loss, but with the slow promise of dawn. A pale light touched the edge of the horizon, not sharp, not insistent, but gentle, as though even morning knew it must arrive softly, so as not to disturb her. The dream folded around her once more, cradling her as the first traces of dawn whispered of a new day. And in her bed her breathing remained steady. Perry stirred faintly at the foot of her bed, lifting his head for only a moment before curling back into his own rest. The house remained wrapped in silence, and Vanessa was completely at peace. The night had done what it was meant to do. It had soothed her, carried her, given her sanctuary. And when morning would finally come, she would wake refreshed, steady, and whole again. But for now she remained in slumber, and the story gently, quietly, drifted closed. And now, as Vanessa rests in her peaceful sleep, it is time for you to drift into your own. Let the calm she found guide you. Let the gentle rhythm of her night carry you into your dreams. Tonight there is no rush, no worry, nothing you need to do. The world will wait. For now, your only task is to rest. Breathe softly. Let your body grow heavy, and let your thoughts drift like stars in a quiet sky. And as this story comes to a close, may your night be filled with the same stillness and comfort that surrounds Vanessa now. If you like the story, make sure to give this video a like and also subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Until then, sleep deeply, dream gently, rest well. Good night.